The sky that bled. 3 million years before the first city, before the first word, before the first tool that wasn't a broken rock, something happened in East Africa that would eventually lead to you watching this video. It wasn't a mutation. It wasn't a migration. It wasn't the birth of some exceptional individual. It was a disaster. Picture this: a family group of Australopithecus afarensis, 23 individuals, including 6 infants, huddled in the pre-dawn darkness of the Ethiopian highlands. They've survived another night. The leopards didn't find them. The hyenas moved on. The infants are hungry, clinging to their mothers, waiting for the light that means safety, that means movement, that means food. But this morning, something is wrong. The oldest female, let's call her what she is, a grandmother, perhaps 30 years old and ancient by the standards of her kind. She's awake. Her nostrils flare. There's something in the air, something she's never smelled before. Not like this, not this strong. It's sharp. It burns the back of her throat. It tastes like nothing in her experience can describe. She doesn't have a word for smoke. She doesn't have a word for anything. But 3 million years later, her descendants will have a word for what's coming. They'll call it wildfire. They'll call it catastrophe. They'll call it the most important meeting in human prehistory. And it's about to begin. The Pliocene epoch. A world you wouldn't recognize, and yet one that shaped everything you are. Africa 3 million years ago was not the Africa of nature documentaries. Forget the endless golden savannas, the scattered acacia trees, the vast open grasslands where lions hunt zebras against a setting sun. That Africa, the iconic Africa, was still being born. The continent was in transition, caught between 2 worlds, and so were its inhabitants. The Ethiopian highlands where our story begins were a patchwork. Dense gallery forests lined the rivers and lakes, their canopies so thick that the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. But step away from the water, climb the gentle slopes, and the trees thinned. Woodlands gave way to bushland. Bushland gave way to something new. Grass. Open grass. Grass that stretched toward horizons that our ancestors were only beginning to comprehend. This was the laboratory where humanity was being designed, and the Australopithecines were the prototype. Let's be clear about what Australopithecus afarensis was, because popular culture has done them a disservice. When you hear Lucy, the famous fossil discovered in 1974, you probably imagine something like a small, hunched, ape-like creature. Something primitive. Something less than. This is wrong. Australopithecus afarensis was one of the most successful species of hominins ever to exist. They thrived for nearly 1 million years across a vast swath of East Africa. They survived climate fluctuations that would have destroyed lesser species. They adapted to environments ranging from closed forests to open woodlands. They were, by any objective measure, an evolutionary triumph. But they were also something else, something that matters for our story. They were curious. Here's what we know about the Australopithecine brain, and here's why it matters. The average Australopithecus afarensis had a cranial capacity of roughly 400 to 550 cubic centimeters. For comparison, a modern chimpanzee averages about 400 cubic centimeters. A modern human averages about 1,350 cubic centimeters. So, on the surface, the Australopithecine brain seems closer to an ape's than to ours. But volume isn't everything. Recent endocast studies, these are analyses of the impressions that ancient brains left on the inside of fossilized skulls, have revealed something remarkable. The Australopithecine brain wasn't just a slightly larger ape brain. It was reorganized. The areas associated with hand-eye coordination were expanded. The regions linked to social cognition were more developed than body size alone would predict. And critically, the prefrontal cortex, that seat of planning, of anticipation, of imagining futures that don't yet exist, showed signs of elaboration. Australopithecus afarensis could think ahead. Not far ahead, not years, probably not even days, but they could anticipate, they could wonder. They could, in some limited but real sense, ask, what if? This matters because of what's about to happen to our grandmother. The smoke is getting thicker now. She's up, fully alert, and the other adults are stirring. They can all smell it, that acrid wrongness in the air. A juvenile male climbs higher in the tree where the group has been sleeping, trying to see, trying to understand. His alarm call, a sharp, barking vocalization, brings everyone to full wakefulness. And then they see it. The horizon is glowing. Not the soft, pink glow of dawn, not the golden warmth of sunrise. This is something else. Something orange, something angry, something alive. The fire is coming. Before we follow our group into what comes next, we need to understand the fire itself. Because Pliocene wildfires were not like modern wildfires, and the difference matters enormously. 3 million years ago, Earth's atmosphere contained slightly more oxygen than it does today, perhaps 21.5% compared to our current 21%. This small difference had a significant effect. Fires burned hotter, spread faster, and were harder to stop. Additionally, the transitional landscape of Pliocene East Africa was a tinderbox waiting for ignition. The dry season created perfect conditions. Grasses that had grown lush during the rains now stood golden and desiccated. Dead wood accumulated in the woodland margins. The gallery forests, usually protected by their moisture, became vulnerable at their edges. All it took was a lightning strike. And lightning was common in the violent storms that marked the seasonal transitions. But here's what made Pliocene fires different from the fires our ancestors would eventually learn to control. They were genuinely wild. Modern wildfires, for all their destructive power, occur in a landscape shaped by millions of years of fire adaptation. Plants have evolved to survive burning. Animals have evolved to flee efficiently. Ecosystems have evolved to regenerate rapidly. The relationship between fire and life has been negotiated over deep time. 3 million years ago, that negotiation was still in its early stages. The fires that swept through Pliocene East Africa were ecological catastrophes on a scale we can barely imagine. They could burn for weeks. They could cover hundreds of square kilometers. They killed not selectively, but wholesale. Anything that couldn't run, fly, or burrow died. And they left behind something remarkable. They left behind food. This is where our story takes its crucial turn. When a major fire sweeps through a Pliocene woodland, the immediate aftermath is devastation. Charred trees, smoking ground, the corpses of animals caught in the flames. Antelope, pigs, rodents, reptiles, birds that couldn't escape the heat and smoke. The air is thick with ash and the smell of death. But within days, something changes. The first rains after a fire, and remember, Fires typically occurred at the dry-wet seasonal transition, transform the burned landscape into something entirely new. The ash releases nutrients into the soil. Seeds that had lain dormant for years, waiting for the signal that competition has been removed, suddenly germinate. Fresh green shoots push up through the blackened earth. Insects arrive to feast on the new growth. And then the herbivores follow, drawn by the tender vegetation that only burned ground can produce. What was a wasteland becomes a garden. But for our purposes, there's something even more important than the ecological succession. There are the carcasses. A large fire kills animals, that's obvious. What's less obvious is what happens to those animals after they die in the flames. Some are incinerated completely, but many, particularly larger animals, are merely killed by smoke inhalation or heat, and then their bodies are changed. They're cooked. Not perfectly, not evenly, but cooked nonetheless. The heat denatures their proteins. The fire renders their fat. The flesh that was dangerous to eat raw, full of parasites, bacteria, tough connective tissue, becomes something else, something softer, something safer, something more nutritious, something that smells different. And Australopithecus afarensis had an excellent sense of smell. Our group survived the night. They fled. This is what primates do when fire threatens. They moved away from the advancing flames, deeper into the gallery forest along the river, where the vegetation was too wet to burn easily. They spent a terrified night listening to the roar and crackle in the distance, watching the sky glow orange, breathing air that hurt their lungs. But now it's morning. The fire has passed, and something is pulling them back. The grandmother is the first to move toward the burned zone. This seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't she be leading the group away from danger? But she's not moving toward danger. The fire is gone. What remains is something her brain doesn't have a category for: the smell. It's not the acrid smoke of burning vegetation. That smell is fading, carried away by the morning breeze. This is something else, something rich, something that speaks to the deepest, oldest parts of her brain, something that says food in a way that raw meat never quite does. She doesn't know what cooking is. She doesn't know that heat transforms proteins. She doesn't know that the Maillard reaction, the chemical process that creates the flavors and aromas of cooked food, is producing volatile compounds specifically designed by evolution to attract scavengers. She only knows that she wants to find the source of that smell. And this is the moment. This is the meeting that will change everything. Australopithecus afarensis is about to encounter cooked meat, and nothing will ever be the same. But here's what the grandmother doesn't know, what she can't possibly know, as she leads her group toward that smoking landscape. She's not alone. Something else has smelled the feast. Something with bigger teeth. Something with a much better understanding of what burned ground contains. The sabertooth cats are already there, and they're hungry too. The Feast of the Dead. The burned landscape stretched before them like a wound in the world. Where yesterday there had been woodland, acacias and figs, bush willows and wild olives, now there was nothing but black. Black earth, black stumps, black skeletons of trees reaching toward a sky still hazy with smoke. The grandmother paused at the edge of the destruction, 1 foot on green grass, 1 foot on ash. Every instinct she possessed screamed danger. The smell of smoke still lingered. The ground was warm beneath her feet, not hot enough to burn, but warm in a way that earth should never be. Strange sounds came from the devastation. the crack of cooling wood, the hiss of steam where the fire had met moisture, the occasional crash of a weakened tree finally surrendering to gravity. This was a dead place, a wrong place, a place where her kind did not belong. And yet that other smell, that rich, complex, intoxicating smell that cut through the char and the ash and spoke directly to something ancient in her brain. Fat, protein, calories, survival. She took another step forward. The ash was soft beneath her feet, almost powdery. It puffed up around her ankles with each step, leaving a trail of small gray clouds. Behind her, the group watched. None of them followed. Not yet. The dominant male, a scarred veteran of perhaps 15 years, gave a low, warning vocalization. This was wrong. This was dangerous. They should retreat to the forest, to the trees, to safety. But the grandmother didn't turn back. She had lived for 30 years in a world that killed most of her kind before they reached 20. She had survived leopard attacks and drought and the birth of 7 infants, 4 of whom had lived. She had watched her mother die and her sisters die, and had kept walking, kept foraging, kept living. She had not survived this long by ignoring the promise of food. Another step. Another. The warmth of the ground increased. And then she saw it. The antelope. It had been a young male, probably a kudu or something similar. It lay on its side in a small clearing, or what had been a clearing before the fire, and was now simply a slightly more open space in the devastation. Its legs were curled beneath it in the position of an animal that had lain down to die. Its eyes were gone, either burned away or already taken by the birds that were beginning to circle overhead. But its body was largely intact, and it was changed. The hide was blackened and cracked in places, pulled tight by the heat. But where the skin had split, the flesh beneath was different. Not the raw red muscle of a fresh kill. Not the gray-green rot of carrion left too long in the sun. This was something else. Brown, firm, and that smell, that incredible smell, was pouring off of it in waves. The grandmother approached slowly, cautiously. Her eyes scanned constantly for danger, for leopards, for hyenas, for anything that might contest this prize. But the burned landscape was empty. The predators had fled the fire just as her group had. They would return, of course. They always returned. But for now, for this brief window, the feast was unguarded. She reached the carcass, squatted beside it, extended one hand toward the flesh. It was still warm. Not the warmth of life. That had fled hours ago, driven out by the flames. This was a different warmth, the residual heat of cooking. The antelope was, in the most literal sense, fresh from the oven. Her fingers touched the exposed flesh. It was softer than raw meat, softer than anything she had ever felt. When she pulled, a piece came away easily. No need to tear, no need to gnaw, no need for the exhausting work of processing raw muscle. She brought it to her mouth, and the world changed forever. We need to pause here and talk about what was happening inside the grandmother's brain. Because this moment, this first taste of cooked meat, was not simply pleasant. It was revolutionary. The human brain is an expensive organ. It comprises roughly 2% of our body weight, but consumes approximately 20% of our metabolic energy. This is an extraordinary investment, and it creates an extraordinary problem. How do you fuel a brain that demands so much? For most of human evolution, the answer was unclear. Our ancestors were not apex predators. They did not have the teeth or claws or speed to hunt large game efficiently. They were not specialized herbivores with the complex digestive systems needed to extract maximum nutrition from plants. They occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, omnivores in a world of specialists. Cooked food changed everything. When meat is cooked, several things happen simultaneously. The proteins denature, that is, their complex molecular structures unwind and become simpler. This makes them dramatically easier to digest. The connective tissues, the collagen and elastin that make raw meat tough and chewy, break down into gelatin. The caloric availability increases substantially. Studies suggest that cooking increases the net energy gain from meat by as much as 30 to 50%. But it's not just about calories, it's about time. A chimpanzee spends roughly 6 hours per day chewing, 6 hours of jaw work just to process enough raw food to survive. Early hominins probably faced similar constraints. Their days were defined by the relentless need to find food, process food, chew food. Cooked food changed the equation. The same calories could be obtained with far less chewing, far less digestive effort, far less time. And that freed time could be spent on other things. Things like thinking. Things like watching. Things like wondering about the strange orange light that had transformed raw flesh into something better. The grandmother didn't understand any of this. She couldn't understand it. Her brain, for all its remarkable development, was not capable of abstract reasoning about nutrition and caloric efficiency. But her body understood. As the first piece of cooked meat hit her stomach, her digestive system responded with something like recognition. This was food, real food, dense, nutritious, easily processed food. The signals that flowed from gut to brain were overwhelmingly positive. More. Get more. This is what you need. This is what you've always needed. She tore off another piece, and another. The sounds of her feeding finally broke the paralysis of the watching group. The dominant male moved first. He could not allow a female to monopolize such a resource. He crossed the ash field in quick, nervous strides, his eyes darting constantly, his posture a complex mix of aggression and fear. But when he reached the carcass, his aggression faded. The smell. That smell. It overwhelmed everything else. He pushed the grandmother aside, gently by the standards of his kind, and claimed the best portion for himself. But there was enough. More than enough. This single antelope, transformed by fire, represented more accessible calories than the group would normally obtain in days of foraging. One by one, the others followed. Mothers carrying infants, juveniles too curious to stay behind, even the most cautious adults, drawn by the sight of their companions feeding without apparent consequence. Within minutes, the entire group was gathered around the carcass, feeding on cooked meat for the first time in their evolutionary history. And none of them noticed what was watching from the smoke-hazed tree line. The sabertooth, Dinofelis probably, one of the false sabertooths that specialized in hunting primates, had survived the fire in a rocky outcrop near the river. It had waited out the flames in a shallow cave, emerging only when the heat had passed and the smoke had begun to clear. Now it was hungry, desperately hungry. The fire had disrupted all normal patterns of hunting and feeding. Prey had scattered. The usual ambush sites were destroyed. The cat had not eaten in 3 days. And here, in the middle of the burned wasteland, was food. Not the cooked antelope. The cat had no interest in carrion, transformed or otherwise. Dinofelis was a hunter, not a scavenger. Its dentition was designed for fresh meat, living meat, meat that struggled and screamed. The Australopithecines would do nicely. The cat began to move. Low to the ground, using the blackened stumps and fallen logs as cover. Its ash-gray coat blended perfectly with the devastated landscape. Its paws made no sound on the soft, char-covered earth. It had done this before, many times. Australopithecines were not difficult prey. Smaller than the cat, weaker than the cat, lacking any natural weapons beyond their hands and their voices. A quick rush, a bite to the neck or skull. It would be over in seconds. The cat selected its target, one of the juveniles, a male of perhaps 6 years, who had wandered slightly apart from the group to gnaw on a piece of meat. The perfect victim. Young, isolated, distracted. Dinofelis gathered its haunches beneath it and prepared to charge. What happened next would be debated by scientists for centuries. Not because the evidence was unclear. There would be no evidence, no fossils, no preserved record of this specific encounter. But because what happened next represented something genuinely new in the history of life on Earth. The grandmother saw the cat. This was not unusual. Australopithecines were constantly vigilant for predators. Their survival depended on early detection. Even while feeding, some part of her awareness had remained alert, scanning the environment for threats. What was unusual was what she did with the information. A normal response, the response that 3 million years of primate evolution had programmed into her neurons, would have been to scream, to give the alarm call, to flee, scatter, climb the nearest tree. But the nearest tree was a burned stump. There were no trees to climb. The normal escape route did not exist. And in that moment of impossible crisis, with a saber-tooth predator gathered to spring and no trees to offer safety, the grandmother's brain did something remarkable. It improvised. Her hand closed around the object nearest to her, a piece of wood. Not a tool. She had no concept of tools. Just a piece of wood. A branch, perhaps, that had fallen from one of the burned trees. It was about the length of her arm. It was still warm, and at one end it was still glowing. The ember pulsed with dim orange light. The grandmother didn't think. There wasn't time to think. 3 million years of instinct screamed at her to run, to flee, to escape. But she didn't run. She turned toward the charging cat, and she swung the burning branch. Fire is one of the oldest fears in the animal kingdom. Long before there were hominins, long before there were primates, long before there were mammals at all, animals learned to fear fire. It was written into their genetics by millions of years of natural selection. Those who fled fire survived. Those who didn't burned. This fear is deep, primal, almost impossible to overcome. Dinofelis was no exception. The cat was mid-charge when the burning branch swung toward its face. The ember at the tip was small, barely a handful of glowing coals, but it was enough. The ancient fear triggered. Every instinct, every neuron, every fiber of the cat's being screamed the same message: fire, danger, retreat. The charge broke. Dinofelis twisted in mid-leap, an almost impossible maneuver for an animal of its size. It hit the ground awkwardly, scrambled, and ran. Not a tactical retreat, not a predator withdrawing to try again. A panicked flight. The blind, mindless flight of an animal confronting something more terrifying than hunger. Within seconds, the cat had vanished into the smoke and the ruins. The grandmother stood alone in the ash, the burning branch still clutched in her hand. She was breathing hard. Her heart was pounding. Every muscle in her body was trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. But she was alive, and she was holding fire. The group had scattered during the attack. Instinct, again, the ancient primate response to predator assault. But they hadn't gone far. There were no trees to climb, no safe refuges to reach. They had simply run in all directions, and now they were returning, drawn back by the absence of pursuit, by the sight of the grandmother still standing, by something else they couldn't quite understand. They gathered around her in a loose semicircle, not too close. The thing in her hand, the burning thing, triggered their own ancient fears. They wanted to run from it. Every instinct said flee. But they didn't flee. They watched. The grandmother looked at the branch in her hand. The ember at its tip was dying now, fading from orange to gray. She didn't understand what it was. She didn't understand how it had saved her. She only knew, in the wordless way that her kind knew things, that this was important. This changed everything. She didn't know how to make fire. She wouldn't know for another 1,000,000 years. She didn't understand fire as a phenomenon, as a tool, as a force that could be controlled and directed. But she understood in that moment that fire could be held. Fire could be used. Fire could save. And that understanding, that single revolutionary realization, was the first step on a journey that would lead, eventually, to nuclear reactors and rocket engines, to furnaces and forges, to every technology that separates humans from the other animals. It started here, in a burned wasteland in Ethiopia, with a grandmother holding a dying ember and a group of early hominins watching her with something that might have been the very first spark of wonder. But the day was not over. The sabertooth would return. It was too hungry not to. And there were other predators in the burned landscape. Hyenas, who had their own ancient relationship with fire and its aftermath, and wild dogs, and leopards who might be more cautious, but no less deadly. The grandmother looked at the ember in her hand. It was almost gray now, almost dead. But there were other branches in the devastation, other coals, other pieces of the fire that had transformed this landscape. And something was stirring in her brain, a connection being made, an idea taking shape in neurons that had never held such a thing before. If one burning branch could save her once, what could many burning branches do? The sun was climbing toward noon. The smoke was beginning to clear, and somewhere in the distance, a hyena laughed its horrible, rising laugh. The feast of the dead was not finished, and neither was the lesson. The cooking hypothesis. Let us leave our grandmother for a moment, standing in the ash with her dying ember, her mind beginning to forge connections that will take 1,000,000 years to fully form, and travel forward in time. Not to our present, not yet, but to a laboratory in Harvard University, where a primatologist named Richard Wrangham is about to change everything we think we know about human evolution. The year is 1999. Wrangham has spent decades studying chimpanzees in the wild, watching them hunt, feed, and struggle with the eternal problem of obtaining enough calories to survive. And he has noticed something that doesn't fit the standard narrative of human evolution. The standard narrative goes like this. Our ancestors became human because they started hunting. Meat provided the dense nutrition needed to fuel larger brains. Hunting required cooperation and planning. Cooperation required communication. Communication became language. Language enabled culture. Culture made us human. It's a clean story, a satisfying story, and Wrangham believes it's wrong. Not entirely wrong. Meat certainly mattered. But there's a problem with the hunting hypothesis, and it's a problem that nobody seems to want to address. Raw meat is incredibly difficult to eat. Wrangham has watched chimpanzees hunt. He has seen them catch colobus monkeys and tear them apart, and he has timed how long it takes them to actually consume their prey. The answer is shocking. Hours. A chimpanzee will chew on a small monkey for 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours, working their powerful jaws to break down the tough muscle fibers and connective tissue. Australopithecines had weaker jaws than chimpanzees, smaller teeth, less powerful chewing muscles. How were they supposed to survive on meat that took hours to process? And then there's the digestive problem. Human intestines are strange. Compared to other apes, our guts are remarkably small, about 60% the size you would expect for an ape of our body mass. Small intestines mean less digestive capacity, less ability to extract nutrition from tough, fibrous foods, less tolerance for the bacteria and parasites that infest raw meat. How did our ancestors survive with these diminished digestive systems? The hunting hypothesis has no good answer, but Wrangham does. Fire. The cooking hypothesis, as Wrangham would eventually call it, is elegant in its simplicity. At some point in our evolutionary history, Wrangham initially suggested around 1.8 million years ago, though the evidence remains debated, our ancestors began to use fire to cook their food. This single behavioral change triggered a cascade of consequences that would reshape the hominin body and brain. Cooked food is easier to chew. The tough connective tissues break down. The muscle fibers soften. What would take hours to consume raw can be eaten in minutes when cooked. Cooked food is easier to digest. The complex proteins denature into simpler forms. The starches gelatinize. The body can extract far more nutrition with far less effort. Cooked food is safer. Heat kills parasites. Heat destroys bacteria. Heat transforms dangerous food into safe food. And cooked food is more caloric. Not because cooking adds calories, it doesn't, but because cooking increases the percentage of calories the body can actually absorb. A raw potato provides roughly half the usable energy of a cooked potato. Raw meat provides perhaps 70% of the energy that cooked meat provides. Put all of this together, and you get a revolution. Suddenly, hominins with access to cooked food had a massive advantage. They could obtain more calories in less time with less risk. They could afford to have smaller teeth, weaker jaws, shorter intestines. They could redirect the energy saved from digestion toward other uses like growing larger brains. The human brain, remember, consumes 20% of our metabolic energy. This is only possible because cooking freed up the caloric budget. Without fire, without cooking, the human brain as we know it could never have evolved. We are, in the most literal sense, creatures of flame. But here's where Wrangham's hypothesis runs into trouble. And here's where our grandmother becomes important again. The oldest confirmed evidence of controlled fire use is approximately 1 million years old. Some sites suggest possible fire use as far back as 1.5 million years. But Wrangham's hypothesis requires cooking to explain anatomical changes that began appearing nearly 2 million years ago, with Homo erectus, whose body proportions and gut size already showed the signatures of a cooked food diet. There's a gap of hundreds of thousands of years. A gap that skeptics have used to challenge the entire cooking hypothesis. Where is the evidence of fire use before 1 million years ago? The answer, increasingly, is that we've been looking for the wrong thing. When scientists search for evidence of fire use, they look for hearths, fire pits, controlled burns, the signatures of hominins who had mastered fire, who could create it and maintain it and use it at will. But mastery is not the same as encounter. What if the relationship between hominins and fire began not with control, but with scavenging? What if, for hundreds of thousands of years before our ancestors learned to make fire, they learned to find it? What if the first great leap was not creating flame, but following it? This is where modern research has begun to focus, and the implications are extraordinary. Wildfires leave distinctive signatures in the landscape. They create patterns that, to a sufficiently intelligent observer, become predictable. Fire moves with the wind. Fire burns uphill faster than downhill. Fire avoids water and wet vegetation. Fire leaves behind burned zones that, within days, become treasure troves of easily processed food. An animal that learned to read these patterns, to predict where fire would go and what it would leave behind, would gain an enormous advantage. We have evidence that some animals already do this. In Australia, certain species of raptors, black kites, whistling kites, and brown falcons, have been observed picking up burning sticks from wildfires and dropping them in unburned grass to start new fires. They do this deliberately, intentionally, to flush prey from hiding. These birds have learned to use fire, not to create it from scratch, but to manipulate existing fire for their benefit. If birds can figure this out, what could a hominin with a larger brain and more flexible behavior accomplish? The answer, increasingly, appears to be quite a lot. Return now to Ethiopia, to the burned landscape, to our grandmother, who has just discovered that fire can be held, can be wielded, can protect. She doesn't understand what she's learned. She can't articulate it, can't pass it on through language, can't write it down for future generations. But something has changed in her neural architecture. A connection has been made. An association has formed. Fire, safety, food. These three concepts, previously unrelated in her mind, have become linked. And here is the critical point. She is not alone. The other members of her group witnessed what happened. They saw the sabertooth charge. They saw the grandmother swing the burning branch. They saw the predator, the monster that had haunted their nightmares since infancy, flee in terror. They saw fire used as a weapon. Australopithecines were not capable of language, but they were supremely capable of social learning. They watched each other constantly. They imitated successful behaviors. They learned not through instruction, but through observation. 22 individuals just watched fire save a life. 22 brains just formed the same association. Fire, safety, food. This is how evolution works at the behavioral level. Not through genetic mutation, that takes generations, but through cultural transmission, through social learning, through the spread of successful strategies from individual to individual. One grandmother, one burning branch, one moment of desperate improvisation, and 22 new minds carrying the seed of an idea that would, eventually, transform the world. But let's be careful here. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The grandmother's discovery was not the beginning of fire control. It was not the beginning of cooking. It was not even the beginning of systematic fire scavenging. It was simpler than that, more basic, more primal. It was the beginning of reduced fear. This is crucial. Every animal fears fire. This fear is hardwired, genetic, almost impossible to overcome. An animal that doesn't fear fire doesn't survive long enough to reproduce. Evolution has been ruthlessly efficient at eliminating any tendency toward fire tolerance. But evolution works on averages, and there's always variation. Some individuals are slightly less fearful than others. Some are more curious. Some have brains that, when confronted with terrifying stimuli, respond not only with flight, but also with observation, with analysis, with the strange mammalian capacity to hold fear and curiosity in balance. The grandmother was such an individual. And her descendants, if she had any, if she survived long enough to reproduce again, might inherit some portion of her reduced fear, her enhanced curiosity, her ability to see opportunity where others saw only danger. This is the dirty secret of evolution. Progress often comes through disaster. The mutation that creates tolerance is useless until it's tested. The capacity for innovation means nothing until innovation becomes necessary. The fire forced the issue. The saber-tooth attack forced the response. And now, standing in the ash with embers at her feet and a dead branch in her hand, the grandmother was part of something larger than herself. She was the first data point in an experiment that would run for 3 million years. The experiment was called humanity, and it was just beginning. The practical consequences of reduced fire fear would have been immediate and substantial. Consider the post-fire landscape. We've already discussed the cooked carcasses, the antelope and pigs and smaller animals killed by smoke and flame, their flesh transformed into something easier to eat and more nutritious. But there's more. Fire cracks nuts. The hard shells of many African nut species, virtually impenetrable to Australopithecine teeth, split open when exposed to high heat. After a fire, the ground is littered with pre-opened seeds, their rich, fatty contents readily accessible. Fire exposes tubers, the underground storage organs of many plants. roots and rhizomes and bulbs packed with carbohydrates, are revealed when fire burns away the surface vegetation. What was hidden becomes visible. What was difficult to dig becomes easy to find. Fire drives insects to the surface. Termites and beetle larvae and other invertebrates, trying to escape the heat, emerge from their underground homes. Protein, concentrated and accessible for any animal brave enough to walk on the still warm ground. A hominin that could tolerate the burned landscape would have access to a bonanza of food resources unavailable to its more fearful competitors. This is the selective pressure. This is how evolution would begin to favor reduced fire fear. Not because some cosmic force wanted hominins to control fire, but because the hominins who could tolerate fire got more calories. More calories meant better survival. Better survival meant more offspring. More offspring meant more spread of whatever genetic and cultural factors contributed to fire tolerance. Generation by generation, century by century, millennium by millennium. The process was beginning. But there's another dimension to consider, one that researchers have only recently begun to explore. Fire doesn't just provide food. Fire provides something else. Something that might have been equally important for the evolution of large brains and complex social behavior. Fire provides light. For millions of years, hominin life was dictated by the sun. When darkness fell, activity ceased. The night belonged to the predators, to the leopards and hyenas and wild dogs whose eyes were adapted for darkness, whose hunting strategies were optimized for the hours when primates were blind and helpless. Night was terror. Night was vulnerability. Night was death waiting in the darkness. But fire pushes back the night. A burning branch, even a small one, even a dying ember, creates a sphere of light. Within that sphere, a hominin can see, can detect threats, can respond before teeth close on throat. This is not abstract. This is not theoretical. The fear of darkness is one of the most universal human phobias, present across all cultures, rooted in millions of years of evolutionary pressure. We fear the dark because, for most of our evolutionary history, the dark was genuinely dangerous. Fire changed that equation. A group with fire, even foraged fire, found fire, fire taken from the aftermath of natural burns, had access to something unprecedented: safe nighttime hours. Hours when they didn't have to sleep. Hours when they could rest without the constant terror of unseen predators. Hours when they could simply be together. And what do social primates do when they're together and safe? They groom, they bond, they interact. They engage in the social behaviors that build coalitions and resolve conflicts, and create the complex webs of relationship that define primate society. Give a group of primates extra hours of safe social time, and you give them extra opportunities for social learning, extra opportunities for building trust, extra opportunities for the kind of interaction that, eventually, would evolve into storytelling and ritual and culture. Fire didn't just cook our food. Fire extended our day. Fire created the space in which humanity would eventually emerge. The grandmother couldn't know any of this. She stood in the ash, holding her dying branch, watching her group slowly reassemble around the carcass they had been feeding on before the sabertooth attacked. The ember was almost dead now, gray ash instead of orange glow, the heat fading from the wood. But there were other branches, other embers. The fire had swept through this landscape only hours ago. The ground was still warm. Here and there, logs still smoldered. Small flames still flickered in protected spaces, feeding on pockets of fuel the main fire had missed. Fire was not gone from this place. Fire was dormant, sleeping, waiting. And something in the grandmother's brain was beginning to understand. Not consciously, not in words, but in the deep associative way that animal brains understand things. The way a dog understands that a certain sound means food is coming. The way a bird understands that a certain pattern of stars means it's time to migrate. The grandmother was beginning to understand fire. She dropped the dead branch, walked toward a smoldering log, reached down, carefully, cautiously, flinching at the heat, and picked up another branch. This one was still glowing, still warm, still alive with that strange orange light. She held it up. The group watched. And then, hesitantly, one of the juvenile females approached, her hand extended, reaching, wanting to hold the fire too. This is how knowledge spreads in species without language, not through instruction, not through explanation, through imitation, through modeling, through the simple act of watching and wanting and trying. The juvenile took the branch from the grandmother's hand, held it awkwardly, stared at the glowing ember with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Then another juvenile approached, and another. Within minutes, half the group was holding burning branches, not using them, not doing anything with them, just holding them, examining them, experiencing the strange sensation of warmth without sun, of light without sky. The dominant male, last to participate, finally selected his own branch. He held it like a weapon, because that was how his brain categorized unfamiliar objects. Something to threaten with, something to intimidate rivals. He swung it experimentally. The ember flared with the movement, the increased airflow briefly intensifying the combustion. The male, startled, almost dropped the branch. But he didn't drop it. He swung again, watched the ember flare, swung again. Cause and effect, stimulus and response. The first faint glimmers of understanding. Fire responds to action. Fire can be made brighter. Fire can be controlled. The sun was past its zenith now. The afternoon stretched ahead, hot and still. The smoke had largely cleared, revealing a sky of deep African blue. The group had fed. They had survived a predator attack. They had discovered something new, several somethings new. But the grandmother was restless. Something was bothering her. Something her brain couldn't quite articulate but wouldn't let go of. The fire was dying. All around the burned landscape, the embers were fading. The logs that had smoldered were cooling. The strange orange light that had saved her, that had terrified the sabertooth, that had captivated her entire group. It was going out, and she didn't know how to make it come back. This was the limit. This was the wall that would take another 1,000,000 years to break through. The grandmother could recognize fire, could tolerate fire, could even, in a limited sense, use fire. But she could not create fire. That secret, the secret of friction and spark, of tinder and fuel, of the careful cultivation of flame from nothing, was beyond her, beyond her species, beyond anything that would exist for countless generations yet to come. She stood watching as the last embers faded to grey, as the warmth leached out of the ground, as the burned landscape transformed from a place of strange wonder to simply a place of devastation. The fire was gone, but the memory remained. and memory, in the long run, would prove to be more powerful than any flame. That night, the group slept in the gallery forest by the river. They climbed into the trees, those that could climb, and huddled on branches, pressed together for warmth and safety. The night was dark. Darker than usual, perhaps, because the smoke had blocked the stars and the moon rose late. The sounds of predators echoed through the forest, the cough of leopards, the whooping of hyenas, the distant roar of something large. The grandmother couldn't sleep. She sat on her branch, staring out toward the burned landscape, invisible now in the darkness, remembering the orange glow, remembering the warmth, remembering the way the sabertooth had fled. Somewhere in the darkness, that same sabertooth was hunting. She could feel it, could sense the presence of death moving through the night. Her group was safe in the trees, probably, but that safety felt thin, fragile, temporary. The fire had been different. The fire had been certain. She didn't have the concepts to think about what she was feeling. She didn't have the cognitive architecture for regret or longing or hope. But something was stirring in her brain nonetheless. A new category being formed, a new desire taking shape. The desire to find fire again. The desire to hold it again. The desire eventually to make it. She was 3 million years too early to fulfill that desire. But she was exactly on time to feel it, to pass it on, to plant the seed that would, generation by generation, grow into something extraordinary. The night stretched on. The predators called. The darkness pressed in from all sides. But somewhere in the grandmother's brain, a small ember still glowed, and it would never quite go out. The Followers of Smoke. Dawn came slowly to the Ethiopian highlands. The grandmother was already awake, had been awake for hours, watching the eastern horizon shift from black to gray to pale gold. She had slept poorly, fragments of rest interrupted by the sounds of the night, by the restless stirring of her own thoughts, by something she could not name. The burned landscape was visible now in the early light, a dark scar against the greens and browns of the surrounding woodland. Steam rose from it in places where the ground still held heat, and somewhere out there, she knew, without knowing how she knew, the embers might still be alive. She began to descend from the tree before the others were fully awake. This was unusual behavior. The group normally moved together, waited for the dominant male to signal readiness, followed the established patterns of foraging and travel that had kept them alive for generations. Individual initiative was rare, dangerous. A solitary Australopithecine was a dead Australopithecine. But the grandmother was not moving toward danger. She was moving toward something else, something her brain had been processing all night, turning over and over in the slow, associative way that animal cognition works. The burned ground, the food, the safety, the fire. She wanted to go back. The others followed, as they always did when a senior member of the group began moving with purpose. The dominant male grunted his displeasure at not being consulted, but he didn't challenge her direction. Perhaps he too remembered the feast of the previous day. Perhaps he too felt the pull of that strange, transformed landscape. They reached the edge of the burn zone as the sun cleared the horizon. Everything looked different in the morning light. The devastation that had seemed apocalyptic yesterday now revealed itself as something more complex. Yes, the trees were dead, the vegetation destroyed, the familiar landmarks erased. But new patterns were emerging. Birds were everywhere. Raptors circled overhead, kites and hawks and vultures, drawn by the promise of carrion and the exposed prey that fire always provided. Smaller birds hopped through the ash, pecking at insects and seeds. The air was full of wings and calls, a cacophony of opportunism. The grandmother had seen birds exploit burned ground before. Everyone had. Fires were not rare in this landscape. What was rare, what was new, was the impulse to join them. She stepped onto the ash. The ground was cooler now, comfortable under her feet. The acrid smell had faded, replaced by something earthier, almost pleasant. The smell of renewal. The smell of nutrients released from destroyed vegetation, already beginning their transformation into new growth. And there, scattered across the burned landscape, were the treasures. Carcasses. Dozens of them. More than yesterday, or perhaps simply more visible now that the smoke had cleared. Small animals mostly, rodents and hares, ground birds and lizards, but also larger prey. Another antelope, a young pig, something that might have been a small zebra. All of them cooked, all of them waiting. What happened over the next several hours was not dramatic. It was not a breakthrough or a revolution. It was something simpler and, in its way, more important. It was a routine being established. The group spread out across the burned landscape, each individual finding their own patch of resources. The grandmother led a cluster of females and juveniles toward a concentration of smaller carcasses. The dominant male claimed the largest antelope for himself and his allies. The adolescents, always more exploratory, ranged farther out, discovering pockets of bounty that the adults had missed. They fed, methodically, efficiently, with a focus that was unusual for their kind. Normal foraging was a scattered, opportunistic affair, a fruit here, a tuber there, constant movement and constant searching. This was different. This was concentrated abundance. This was the closest thing to a feast that Australopithecines ever experienced. And they remembered. This is the key. This is what separates this day from all the other days in which African animals exploited post-fire landscapes. The Australopithecines didn't just eat and move on. They remembered. They formed associations. They built mental maps. Fire means food. Burned ground means safety from predators. Smoke means opportunity. These associations, forming simultaneously in 23 different brains, were the beginning of something unprecedented. Not culture exactly, that would come later, but proto-culture, shared knowledge, a collective understanding that would persist beyond individual memory, that would be transmitted from generation to generation, that would grow and elaborate over time. The experiment had begun in earnest. But the burned landscape offered more than just food. As the morning progressed, the grandmother found herself drawn toward a section of the burn zone where several logs still smoldered. She approached cautiously, feeling the heat radiating from the wood, watching the thin threads of smoke rising toward the sky. The embers were still alive, not bright, not the fierce orange of yesterday's fire, but alive nonetheless, glowing deep within the charred wood, waiting. She squatted near the logs, extended her hand toward the heat, flinched back, extended again, flinched again. This was learning. Raw, physical, experiential learning. Heat causes pain. Heat must be respected. But heat can also be approached, studied, understood. She found a stick, a green stick, unburned, brought from the forest edge. She poked at the embers. They flared briefly where she touched them, the increased oxygen flow causing a momentary intensification. She watched, poked again, watched the flare, poked again. Cause and effect. This is fire behavior. This is how fire responds to stimulus. A juvenile, the same female who had taken the burning branch from the grandmother's hand yesterday, approached and squatted beside her. She watched the poking, watched the flaring, reached for the stick. The grandmother let her take it. The juvenile poked at the embers, watched them flare. Her eyes were wide, intense, focused with an attention that her kind rarely devoted to anything except threats and food. This was something else. This was curiosity. Pure, undirected curiosity. The desire to understand without any immediate practical purpose. We think of curiosity as a uniquely human trait. It isn't. But the intensity of it, the persistence of it, the willingness to explore things that aren't immediately relevant to survival, that is something that hominins developed to an unprecedented degree. And fire, it seems, was one of the catalysts. By midday, something unexpected had happened. The group was not dispersing. Normally, after a period of intensive feeding, Australopithecines would move on. They would return to the forest, to the trees, to the safety of their usual patterns. They had no concept of staying in one place. Sedentism was millions of years away. But today, they stayed. Part of it was the food. There was simply too much to leave behind. The burned landscape was so rich in resources that the normal imperative to move on was overwhelmed by the sheer abundance. But part of it was something else, something harder to explain. The smoldering logs. Throughout the morning, various members of the group had drifted toward the areas where fire still lived. They sat near the warmth. They poked at the embers. They watched the smoke. There was no practical purpose to this behavior. They weren't cooking, weren't using the fire as a tool, weren't doing anything useful. They were just present, near the fire, with the fire. This is the first hint of what would eventually become one of humanity's most defining characteristics: the gathering around the flame, the campfire, the hearth, the place where humans come together, share warmth, share light, share stories. 3 million years before the first true campfire, the pattern was beginning to emerge. The afternoon brought a test. The hyenas had been watching since morning. A clan of 8, experienced scavengers who knew exactly what burned ground contained. They had been waiting for the Australopithecines to leave, as other animals always left, so they could claim the remains. But the Australopithecines weren't leaving. Finally, the dominant female of the hyena clan made a decision. She began to approach. Hyenas are not to be underestimated. They are among the most successful predators in Africa, intelligent, cooperative, and powerful. Their jaws can crush bone. Their endurance can run down any prey. And they are aggressive, far more willing to confront other species than the sabertooths and leopards that rely on ambush. The dominant male of the Australopithecine group saw her coming. He stood upright, maximizing his apparent size, and began the alarm call that would bring the others together. Within seconds, the group had clustered. Females pulled infants close. Juveniles scrambled for the center of the formation. This was the standard response. Band together, make noise, appear as large and threatening as possible. It usually worked against lone predators. It was less effective against a determined hyena clan. The hyenas kept coming. 8 of them now, spread in a loose crescent, advancing steadily. Their whooping calls echoed across the burned landscape. Their intent was clear. They wanted the carcasses, and they were prepared to fight for them. The grandmother watched them come, watched her group's defensive formation, watched the fear on every face, the trembling of every body. And then she remembered. The smoldering logs were perhaps 30 meters away, too far to reach if she ran, if the hyenas decided to pursue. But she had been sitting near them only minutes ago. She had been poking at them with a stick that was still there, lying on the ground, its tip blackened and smoking. The grandmother broke from the group and ran. The dominant male screamed at her, not words, but the unmistakable vocalization of fury and fear. Breaking formation was suicide. Breaking formation was betrayal. Breaking formation was everything wrong that an Australopithecine could do. But she kept running. The hyenas saw her separate from the group, saw a lone individual, fleeing, vulnerable. The dominant female changed her trajectory, moving to intercept. An easy kill, a statement of dominance. The grandmother reached the logs. She grabbed the stick. Its tip was still smoking, still carrying the embers that she had been playing with all morning. She spun to face the approaching hyena. The animal was close now, close enough to see its teeth, close enough to smell its breath, close enough to die. The grandmother swung the stick. The ember at its tip flared with the motion, the sudden oxygen flow reigniting the combustion. A spray of sparks flew toward the hyena's face. Small flames licked along the wood. The hyena stopped. Not retreated, not fled, but stopped. Its ancient brain processing the signal. Fire. Fire means danger. Fire means pain. Fire means the thing that all animals fear more than any predator, more than any rival, more than death itself. The grandmother swung again, stepped forward, swung again. The hyena backed away, and then, suddenly, it turned and ran. The other hyenas, watching their leader flee, followed. Within seconds, the entire clan had retreated beyond the edge of the burned zone, their whooping calls now carrying a different message. Not threat, but confusion. Not aggression, but something almost like fear. The grandmother stood alone in the ash, her burning stick held high, her chest heaving, her heart pounding. She had done it again. Fire had saved them again. The implications of this moment cannot be overstated. The grandmother had just demonstrated something that no other animal on Earth could do. She had used fire as a weapon. Not accidentally, not instinctively, but deliberately. She had remembered yesterday's lesson. She had seen the threat. She had identified the tool. She had executed the defense. This is cognitive complexity of a very high order. And she had done it in front of her entire group. 22 pairs of eyes had watched her break formation. 22 brains had expected to see her die. 22 individuals had witnessed her triumph instead. The lesson was searing itself into their collective consciousness. Fire protects. Fire can be used. Fire changes everything. The rest of the afternoon was quiet. The hyenas didn't return. No other predators challenged the group's claim to the burned landscape. The Australopithecines fed and rested and, increasingly, gathered near the smoldering logs. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, the grandmother made another discovery. The embers were dying. All day she had been poking at them, watching them flare, enjoying the warmth and light. But now, with evening approaching, she noticed that each flare was weaker than the last. The glow was fading. The heat was diminishing. The fire was going out. And something in her brain understood, not clearly, not consciously, but in that deep associative way, that when the fire went out, the safety would go too. The hyenas would return. The leopards would come. The darkness would bring back all the terrors that the fire had temporarily banished. She didn't want the fire to go out. She poked at the embers more vigorously. They flared, but only briefly. She poked harder. The flare was even weaker. This wasn't working. She looked around the burned landscape, looked at the ash, the charred stumps, the devastated vegetation. And her eyes fell on something. A pile of dried grass that had somehow survived the fire, protected by a fallen log. Dried grass. She had seen grass burn yesterday, had watched the fire race through the golden stalks, consuming them in seconds. Grass and fire went together. Grass made fire stronger. She picked up a handful of the dried grass, approached the dying embers, dropped the grass onto the coals. Nothing happened. Then, suddenly, everything happened. The grass ignited. Not slowly, not gradually, but in a sudden whoosh of flame that made the grandmother stumble backward. The fire surged upward, bright and hot and alive. Sparks flew. Smoke billowed. The embers that had been dying were now the heart of a genuine blaze. The group scattered, screaming. Fire meant danger. Fire meant flee. Every instinct, every ancestor, every lesson of evolution said run. But the grandmother didn't run. She stood watching the fire she had made. Not made from nothing. She couldn't do that. Wouldn't be able to do that for another 1,000,000 years. But made stronger, made bigger, made from dying embers into living flame. She had fed the fire, and the fire had responded. This is the moment when everything changed. Not the first encounter with cooked meat, not the first use of fire as a weapon, but this. The first deliberate feeding of fire, the first act of fire maintenance. Because fire, unlike any other resource that early hominins used, can be preserved. It can be kept alive. It can be fed and nurtured and maintained. But only if you understand the principle. Only if you grasp the fundamental truth that fire needs fuel. The grandmother had just grasped that truth. She hadn't understood it. She couldn't explain it. But she had acted on it, and her action had produced a result. Cause and effect once again. Stimulus and response. Give fire fuel, and fire grows. This is the secret. This is the key that would eventually unlock all of human civilization. Not the creation of fire. That would come later, and it would come from this. From the understanding that fire is not a thing, but a process. That fire needs. That fire can be served. The grandmother had become, in that moment, the first servant of fire. And fire, in return, would serve her descendants for the rest of time. The flames died down as the grass was consumed. But the embers were brighter now, stronger, revitalized by the fuel. The grandmother looked around for more grass, more fuel, more food for the hungry flames. She found a small branch. Dried by the fire, its bark peeling away, its wood exposed. She placed it on the embers. Nothing happened. Then, slowly, the wood began to smoke. Then to char. Then, finally, to catch. The fire was burning again. The grandmother turned to face her group. They had retreated to the edge of the burn zone, watching her with wide eyes. What she was doing was terrifying. What she was doing was impossible. What she was doing was new. But the fire was warm, and the fire was bright, and the darkness was coming. Slowly, hesitantly, the group began to approach. First the dominant male, reasserting his role, his right to be near anything important. Then the other adults, then the juveniles, then the mothers with their infants, last and most cautious, staying at the edge of the firelight, but not retreating into the darkness. They gathered around the fire, not too close. The heat was still fearsome, still triggered alarms in their ancient brains, but close enough to feel the warmth, close enough to see each other's faces in the flickering light, close enough to experience something that no Australopithecine had ever experienced before: a nighttime gathering without fear. The night fell. The darkness came. And for the first time in 3 million years of hominin evolution, a group of Australopithecines did not spend those hours in terror. They sat around the fire. They fed the fire. Others had begun to imitate the grandmother, bringing grass and sticks to place on the flames. The fire flared and danced and cast strange shadows across the ash field. The predators stayed away. The hyenas, who could be heard whooping in the distance, did not approach. The leopards, who must have been watching from the darkness, did not strike. The fire protected them. And something else happened. Something that might have been even more important than the protection. They groomed. They socialized. They engaged in the quiet, continuous physical contact that was the foundation of Australopithecine social life. But they did it longer than usual, deeper than usual, without the constant interruption of fear and vigilance. The fire gave them time. Time to bond. Time to strengthen relationships. Time to engage in the social learning that would eventually transmit the lessons of this day to future generations. Time to become something new. The grandmother sat at the edge of the firelight, watching her group, watching the flames, watching the night that no longer seemed quite so threatening. She was tired. The day had been long, filled with discoveries that her brain could barely process. Tomorrow there would be more challenges. The fire would eventually die. The burned landscape would eventually be depleted. They would have to move on, return to the forest, return to the old patterns. But something had changed. Something fundamental. Something irreversible. She had met fire. She had feared fire. She had used fire. She had fed fire. And fire, in its own alien way, had accepted her. This was the relationship that would define human history. This was the partnership that would carry her descendants out of Africa and across the world. This was the alliance that would power every technology, every civilization, every achievement of the species that did not yet exist but was, in this moment, taking its first uncertain steps toward becoming. The fire crackled. The sparks rose toward the stars, and the grandmother, 3 million years before the first word for fire would be spoken, watched them go. Morning would bring new challenges. The fire would eventually die, as all fires die. The group would have to learn, again and again, the lessons of this extraordinary day. It would take countless generations before fire became truly tamed, truly controlled, truly theirs. But the path was set. The followers of smoke had been born, and they would never turn back. 1,000,000 years of smoke. Time moves differently for species than it does for individuals. The grandmother died. This is not speculation, it is certainty. She died within a few years of that transformative encounter with fire, perhaps from disease, perhaps from predation, perhaps simply from the accumulated wear of 35 hard years in the Pliocene. Her body was consumed by scavengers, her bones scattered across the Ethiopian highlands. No fossil preserves her memory. No record exists of her individual existence. But her legacy survived. The lessons of those days: fire means food, fire means safety, fire can be fed, did not die with her. They lived on in the minds of those who had watched her, in the juvenile female who had taken the burning branch from her hand, in the dominant male who had learned to swing fire at predators, in the infants who had grown up in those first nights of firelight, their developing brains shaped by an experience no previous generation had known. These individuals grew, they reproduced, they passed on their knowledge, not through language, which they did not have, but through demonstration, through modeling, through the slow, patient process of social learning that primates had perfected over millions of years. A generation passed, then another, then 100 more, and the behavior spread. We have no direct evidence of this spreading. The archaeological record of 3 million years ago is sparse, fragmentary, maddeningly incomplete. Bones survive. Stone tools survive when they exist. Fire leaves traces: charcoal, ash, burned bone. But these traces are fragile, easily destroyed by the same geological processes that preserve fossils. What we have instead is inference, deduction, the careful reconstruction of likely events from the evidence that does survive. And what the evidence suggests is this: by approximately 2.5 million years ago, something had changed in hominin behavior. The stone tools appear. Not the fire, that would come later, in detectable form, but the tools, the first deliberately shaped implements. The Oldowan industry, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where these artifacts were first discovered in abundance. These tools are simple by later standards. They are cobbles that have been struck to produce sharp edges. They are flakes that have been removed and used for cutting. They show little standardization, little refinement, little of the sophisticated planning that would characterize later toolmaking. But they represent something revolutionary. They represent hominins who were thinking ahead, planning, anticipating future needs, and creating objects to meet those needs. Hominins who had crossed a cognitive threshold that most animals never approach. What triggered this threshold? What selective pressure drove the emergence of tool use? The traditional answer is meat. Hunting and scavenging required tools to process carcasses. The need for tools drove the evolution of the cognitive capacities needed to make them. But there's another possibility. A possibility that connects directly to our grandmother and her fire. Consider what fire scavenging requires. You need to find the fire, or rather, find the aftermath of fire. This means reading the landscape, watching for smoke on distant horizons, understanding wind patterns and terrain, remembering where fires have burned before. You need to reach the burned area quickly before competitors claim the resources. This means planning travel routes, anticipating how long journeys will take, carrying supplies, water perhaps, or food for the journey. You need to exploit the burned landscape efficiently. This means understanding the distribution of resources, knowing where carcasses are likely to be found, knowing how to access cooked meat, cracked nuts, exposed tubers. And you need to maintain fire when you find it. This means understanding fuel, knowing what burns and what doesn't, planning ahead to ensure the fire doesn't die before you're ready to move on. Every single one of these requirements places selective pressure on cognitive abilities: planning, memory, causal reasoning, anticipation, the exact capacities that would eventually enable tool manufacture. What if tools and fire are not separate developments? What if they are two expressions of the same underlying cognitive revolution? What if the grandmother's descendants, learning to track smoke and tend embers, were simultaneously developing the mental architecture that would enable them to shape stone? We cannot prove this. The evidence is too sparse, too ancient, too fragmentary. But the timing is suggestive. Let us move forward. 500,000 years after the grandmother's death, 2.5 million years before our present day, the world has changed. The Pliocene has given way to the Pleistocene. The great ice ages have begun, their rhythmic pulses of cold and warmth reshaping the planet every 100,000 years. Africa remains warm, but even here the effects are felt. The climate swings between wet and dry. Forests expand and contract. Grasslands march forward and retreat. And in this changing world, a new kind of hominin has emerged. Australopithecus is still present, several species, in fact, scattered across eastern and southern Africa. But they are no longer alone. A new lineage has appeared, different enough to warrant a new genus. Homo. Specifically, Homo habilis, the handy human, the toolmaker. Homo habilis is not dramatically different from the Australopithecines. It is slightly larger, slightly more gracile, with a brain perhaps 30% bigger than its predecessors. These seem like modest changes. They are not. That 30% increase in brain size represents an enormous metabolic investment. Brains are expensive. They consume energy at a rate far out of proportion to their mass. For Homo habilis to afford a larger brain, something else had to change. The gut. Fossil evidence suggests that Homo habilis had a smaller, more efficient digestive system than Australopithecus. This is the signature that Richard Wrangham would later identify as evidence of dietary change. Something was providing Homo habilis with more easily digestible food. Something was allowing them to extract more calories with less digestive effort. That something, almost certainly, was cooked food. We cannot say with confidence that Homo habilis controlled fire. The evidence is ambiguous. There are sites with possible burned bone, possible charcoal concentrations, possible hints of deliberate fire use, but nothing definitive, nothing that survives the scrutiny of skeptical analysis. What we can say is that Homo habilis behaved differently than Australopithecus in one crucial respect. They followed the smoke. Site after site from this period shows the same pattern. Homo habilis remains concentrated in areas with high fire frequency. Their tools are found in landscapes where natural fires were common. Their bones cluster in regions where burned ground would have been a regular feature of the environment. This could be coincidence. It probably isn't. A million years after the grandmother first held a burning branch, her behavioral descendants had become systematic exploiters of fire-transformed landscapes. They hadn't tamed fire, they hadn't mastered fire, but they had learned to follow it, to predict it, to benefit from it. They had become, in the most literal sense, fire foragers. And this ecological strategy, this niche that no other species had ever occupied, was providing them with the caloric surplus needed to grow larger brains. But following fire is not the same as controlling fire, and the gap between these two states would take another million years to close. What did that gap look like? How did hominins relate to fire during this long intermediate period? We can reconstruct some possibilities from what we know about fire-following behavior in other species, and from the logic of the situation. First, fire-following hominins would have needed to become excellent readers of weather and landscape. Fires are not random. They occur when conditions are right. Dry fuel, ignition source, wind to spread the flames. A hominin who could predict where fires were likely to occur would have a significant advantage over one who simply stumbled upon burned areas. This means watching the sky, learning to recognize the thunderstorms that bring lightning, understanding the seasonal patterns of drought and rain, building mental maps of the landscape that included information about fuel loads and fire history. This is sophisticated cognition. This is the kind of environmental intelligence that modern hunter-gatherers possess in abundance. And it was being selected for, generation by generation, in the hominins who depended on fire-transformed landscapes for their survival. Second, fire-following hominins would have developed increasingly sophisticated fire maintenance behaviors. Once you find fire, keeping it alive becomes critical. Every fire that dies is an opportunity lost. Every ember that fades means returning to darkness and danger. We see hints of this in the archaeological record. Sites with repeatedly burned areas, locations where fire occurred again and again over long periods. These could be natural fire traps, places where geography channeled fires repeatedly. Or they could be something else. They could be places where hominins kept fire alive. Not forever, not reliably, not with the confidence that would come with true fire-making, but intermittently, opportunistically, long enough to matter. A group that could maintain fire for even a few days, feeding it fuel, sheltering it from rain, carrying embers when they traveled, would have an enormous advantage over a group that simply exploited fires when they found them. And so the behavior would spread, would be selected for, would become more sophisticated with each passing generation. Now we make another jump, a bigger one this time, 1.5 million years ago. Halfway between the grandmother's time and our own. Africa has changed again. The Pleistocene ice ages are in full swing. The northern hemisphere periodically disappears under miles of ice. Sea levels drop and rise by hundreds of feet. The climate whipsaws between extremes. And in East Africa, a new hominin has emerged, one that will finally close the gap between fire-following and fire-making. Homo erectus. This is the species that changes everything. Homo erectus is not a modest upgrade from its predecessors. It is a revolution. The brain has nearly doubled from Australopithecine levels, 900 cubic centimeters or more, compared to 400 for the grandmother's kind. The body has transformed into something startlingly modern, tall, long-legged, built for endurance travel across open landscapes. The face has flattened. The teeth have shrunk. The gut has reduced to nearly modern human proportions. Homo erectus looks, for the first time, genuinely human. And Homo erectus, the evidence increasingly suggests, controlled fire. The site is called Wonderwerk Cave. It lies in South Africa's northern Cape province, a deep solution cavity that has been collecting sediments for millions of years. And in those sediments, dated to approximately 1 million years ago, archaeologists have found something extraordinary. Burned bone, ash, charred plant remains, all concentrated in specific areas of the cave, all showing patterns consistent with deliberate fire use rather than natural burning. This is not the oldest claimed evidence of fire use. There are sites that push the date back further, 1.5 million years, perhaps even 1.8 million. But Wonderwerk is among the most convincing. The cave setting rules out wildfire. The concentration of burned materials suggests repeated use. The association with stone tools and other hominin remains connects the fire to deliberate activity. 1 million years ago, Homo erectus was using fire inside caves. This is a threshold crossed. This is the moment when fire transitions from something found to something controlled. But there's a question that lingers, a question that the archaeological record cannot definitively answer. Did Homo erectus make fire? Or did they simply become so good at keeping fire that the distinction became almost meaningless? The difference matters more than you might think. Making fire requires technology. It requires understanding the principles of friction or percussion. It requires the right materials: dry tinder, a fire drill, or flint and steel, the skill to use them effectively. Making fire is hard. Even modern humans, with all our knowledge and practice, find it challenging without manufactured tools. Keeping fire is different. Keeping fire requires attention, fuel, and dedication. It requires treating fire as a living thing that must be fed and protected. It requires social organization. Someone must tend the fire at all times, even through the night. Both capabilities lead to fire control, but they have different implications. A species that can make fire is never without it. They can lose their flame and create a new one. They can travel light, knowing that fire awaits them at any destination. A species that can only keep fire is bound to their flames. They must carry fire with them, protect it from rain and accident, never let it die. Their relationship with fire is more intimate, more demanding, more central to their social organization. There is evidence, controversial but suggestive, that for much of Homo erectus's long reign, they fell into the second category: fire keepers rather than fire makers. If this is true, then the relationship between humans and fire was even more transformative than we usually recognize. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors organized their entire existence around keeping their fires alive. They built their social structures around the flame. They traveled according to its demands. They lived and died by their ability to maintain the most precious resource in their world. Fire wasn't just a tool for Homo erectus. Fire was a member of the family. Picture a Homo erectus band 1 million years ago. They are traveling across the East African landscape, following a route that their ancestors have used for generations. There are perhaps 30 of them, more than the Australopithecine group we followed earlier. Homo erectus lives in larger groups, can afford to because cooked food provides the calories to support more individuals. At the center of the group, an adult female carries something precious. It is a bundle of smoldering wood, wrapped in green leaves to insulate it from rain, held carefully to maintain airflow without letting the embers die. Smoke rises from it in a thin stream, marking the group's passage across the landscape. This is the fire carrier. In some groups, there might be several, ensuring redundancy in case one flame fails. This role is crucial, the most important task in the entire band. When they stop to rest, the fire carrier's first job is to build up the flame. She unwraps her bundle, places the embers on a prepared bed of tinder, blows gently to encourage combustion. The flame catches. The fire lives. Others gather fuel, a constant preoccupation. Dry wood, dried grass, anything that burns. The camp must have enough fuel to last through the night and to provide coals for tomorrow's travel. Still others begin preparing food. Meat from yesterday's hunt is brought out. Tubers dug from the ground are placed in the coals. The transformation that began with the grandmother, accidental, opportunistic, has become systematic, deliberate, integral to survival. And as evening falls, the band gathers around the fire. Not too close, the heat is still dangerous, but close enough for warmth, close enough for light, close enough to see each other's faces, to engage in the social behaviors that have been growing more complex with each passing generation. Someone is making a hand axe. The Acheulean industry has emerged. Beautifully symmetrical teardrop-shaped tools that require far more planning and skill than the crude Oldowan implements. The toolmaker works by firelight, the flickering illumination allowing craft to extend beyond daylight hours. Someone else is tending a wound. Homo erectus cares for its injured. There is fossil evidence of individuals who survived serious injuries that would have been fatal without help from their group. The firelight allows wound cleaning and bandaging to happen at night, when the patient can rest. And everywhere there is talk. Not language, not yet. Homo erectus probably did not have fully modern language. The anatomical prerequisites were still evolving. But something. Vocalizations more complex than those of earlier hominins. Gestures more nuanced. The beginnings of symbolic communication. The fire makes this possible. The fire creates the time. The fire provides the context in which communication becomes valuable, in which social bonds strengthen, in which culture, true culture, begins to emerge. This is the world that fire built. Not in a single moment, not through a single invention, but gradually, over 1,000,000 years, through the accumulated efforts of countless generations. The grandmother who first held a burning branch could not have imagined it. She lived in a world of darkness and fear, where fire was a rare and terrifying phenomenon. She took a single step, holding the flame instead of fleeing it, and that step echoed forward through time. Her children learned to tolerate fire. Her grandchildren learned to seek it. Their descendants learned to follow the smoke. And eventually, after hundreds of thousands of years of following, finding, and keeping, one of those descendants figured out how to make fire from scratch. We don't know who this was. We don't know when it happened. We don't know if it was a single invention or multiple independent discoveries. The archaeological record is silent on these details. But we know it happened, and we know what came next. When humans gained the ability to make fire at will, the last constraint fell away. No longer bound to maintain existing flames, humans could travel anywhere, could colonize new environments, could spread across the world, and they did. Homo erectus, or their immediate descendants, left Africa. They crossed into Asia. They reached Indonesia. They survived in environments that would have been uninhabitable without fire's warmth. Later humans would go further. They would cross into Europe, into the frozen north, into Australia and the Americas. They would colonize every continent except Antarctica. They would become the most widely distributed large mammal on Earth. Fire made this possible. Fire and the million-year journey that led from a grandmother holding a burning branch to a species that could conjure flame from nothing. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Return for a moment to that Homo erectus band around their campfire. The toolmaker is finishing his hand axe. The wounded individual is being tended. The fire crackles and sparks into the African night. Something is happening here that has never happened before in the history of life on Earth. Intelligence is accumulating. Each generation learns from the previous one. Each generation adds something new. The process is slow, agonizingly slow by modern standards, but it is inexorable. Knowledge builds on knowledge. Skill builds on skill. Understanding builds on understanding. This is the ratchet of culture, the mechanism by which humans would eventually transform the world. It doesn't exist without fire. It cannot exist without the time that fire provides, the safety that fire ensures, the social context that fire creates. The grandmother didn't know she was starting this process. She couldn't have known. She was just trying to survive, just responding to immediate circumstances, just doing what her curious and capable brain suggested. But she was also doing something more. She was beginning the conversation between humanity and fire, a conversation that continues to this day, a conversation that will continue as long as humans exist. The stars wheel overhead. The fire burns low. The Homo erectus band sleeps, secure in their ring of light. Somewhere in the darkness, predators watch and wait, but they do not approach. They have learned over 1,000,000 years that the creatures who carry fire are not to be trifled with. The world has changed, and it will never change back. The brain that fire built. There is an organ in your head that should not exist. The human brain weighs approximately 1.4 kilograms, about 2% of your total body mass. Yet this small organ consumes roughly 20% of your daily caloric intake. 20%. 1/5 of everything you eat goes to feeding the 3 pounds of tissue behind your eyes. This is, from an evolutionary perspective, insane. Brains are expensive. They require constant fuel, glucose primarily, delivered through an elaborate network of blood vessels. They generate enormous amounts of heat that must be dissipated. They demand oxygen at a rate that leaves almost no margin for interruption. 4 minutes without oxygen, and brain cells begin to die. 6 minutes, and the damage becomes catastrophic. No other organ in the body is so demanding. No other organ would be tolerated if it didn't provide extraordinary benefits. And yet, for most of mammalian evolution, brains stayed small. They had to. The caloric cost was simply too high. A mouse-sized mammal cannot afford a human-sized brain. The metabolic math doesn't work. So how did we end up with these extraordinary organs? How did natural selection produce a structure so expensive, so demanding, so utterly impractical by the standards of normal biology? The answer is fire. The answer is the grandmother. The answer is a chain of consequences that began 3 million years ago in a burned Ethiopian landscape and continued until the thing reading these words came into existence. Let us begin with a paradox. The human brain is not simply a larger version of an ape brain. It is restructured, reorganized, different in ways that go far beyond mere size. Consider the prefrontal cortex, the region behind your forehead, responsible for planning, decision-making, impulse control, and abstract thought. In humans, this region comprises roughly 30% of total cortical volume. In chimpanzees, it's about 17%. In most other mammals, it's smaller still. This is not just scaling. This is specialization. The human brain has invested disproportionately in precisely those regions that enable complex thought, long-term planning, and social cognition. Consider also the temporal lobes, home to language processing and memory formation, dramatically expanded in humans. The parietal lobes, responsible for spatial reasoning and tool use, enlarged and reorganized. The cerebellum, once thought to be purely motor coordination, now recognized as crucial for cognitive processing, expanded in humans beyond what body size alone would predict. Every region associated with what we think of as distinctly human cognition shows evidence of selective expansion and reorganization. But here's the paradox. These changes require enormous energy, and energy, in evolutionary terms, means food. The more brain you have, the more food you need. The more specialized your brain becomes, the more demanding its caloric requirements. How do you pay for a human brain? You need a revolution in diet. The neuroscientist Susanna Herculano-Houzel has spent her career counting neurons. This sounds simple. It is not. For decades, estimates of neuron numbers were based on extrapolations. Count the neurons in a small sample, multiply by the total brain volume, hope for the best. Herculano-Houzel developed a better method. She dissolves brain tissue into a soup of nuclei, stains the neurons specifically, and counts them directly. Her findings have revolutionized our understanding of brain evolution. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons. This is more than any other primate, but not by as much as you might expect. A gorilla brain, about 1/3 the size of ours, contains around 33 billion neurons. The relationship between brain size and neuron count is not linear. But here's what's remarkable. Human neurons are packed more densely than great ape neurons. Our brains are not just bigger, they are more efficiently organized. More processing power per unit volume. And this efficiency has a cost. Herculano-Houzel calculated that the human brain requires approximately 516 kilocalories per day just to maintain itself. This is an enormous figure. A great ape of similar body size would have a brain requiring perhaps 250 to 300 kilocalories. We are paying twice the metabolic price for our cognitive abilities. How do you afford this? You can't, not on a raw food diet. Herculano-Houzel worked out the math. A great ape eating raw food can sustain a brain of about 30 billion neurons, maybe 40 billion if they spend every waking hour eating. But 86 billion? Impossible. The gut cannot process enough raw calories. The day does not contain enough hours. Unless you cook your food. Cooking transforms the equation entirely. A cooked potato provides roughly twice the usable calories of a raw potato. Cooked meat provides 30 to 50% more net energy than raw meat. The processing that fire performs, denaturing proteins, gelatinizing starches, breaking down cell walls, effectively pre-digests food before it enters the body. This means less work for the gut, less time spent processing, less metabolic investment in digestive tissue. And here is the crucial trade-off. In mammals, there is a rough inverse relationship between gut size and brain size. You can have a large digestive system or a large brain, but not both. The metabolic budget doesn't allow it. Great apes have large guts. They need them to process their raw, fibrous, difficult-to-digest diets. Hours of chewing, hours of digestion, enormous intestines packed with bacteria to break down plant cell walls. Humans have small guts. Proportionally, our digestive system is about 60% the size you would expect for an ape of our body mass. This is not because we're poorly designed. It's because we don't need large guts anymore. Fire is our external stomach. Fire does the processing that other animals must do internally. And by outsourcing digestion to fire, we freed up metabolic resources that could be redirected elsewhere. They were redirected to the brain. This is the cooking hypothesis at its most powerful. Not just that cooking made food easier to eat, though it did. Not just that cooking made food safer, though it did. But that cooking fundamentally restructured the metabolic economy of the hominin body, enabling investment in neural tissue that would have been impossible otherwise. The grandmother, holding her first piece of cooked meat, was not just eating a meal. She was taking the first step toward your prefrontal cortex. She was beginning the process that would eventually produce Mozart and Einstein and every thought you've ever had. She couldn't have known this. The connection between her action and its ultimate consequences spans 3 million years and countless intermediate steps. But the connection is real. The causal chain is unbroken. Fire built the human brain. But the story is more complex than simple calories. Fire didn't just provide energy for brain growth. Fire provided the context in which larger brains became useful. Consider the problem from evolution's perspective. A larger brain is expensive. We've established that. But expense alone doesn't prevent evolution from creating something. It just means the benefits must outweigh the costs. A larger brain will be selected for if and only if it provides advantages that justify its metabolic price. What advantages could a larger brain provide to early hominins? The traditional answer focuses on ecological challenges. Larger brains enable better foraging strategies, better predator avoidance, better tool use. All true, all important. But there's another answer that has gained increasing support in recent decades: social complexity. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar has proposed what he calls the social brain hypothesis. His argument, based on extensive comparative analysis, is that primate brain size correlates most strongly not with ecological variables, but with social ones. Specifically, with the size and complexity of social groups. Larger brains enable larger social networks. Larger social networks provide survival advantages through cooperation, information sharing, and mutual defense. Therefore, primates living in larger groups evolved larger brains to manage the cognitive demands of complex social relationships. This hypothesis has powerful explanatory value. It helps explain why primates, among mammals, have disproportionately large brains. It explains patterns of brain evolution across primate species. It provides a framework for understanding human cognitive evolution. But there's a problem with the social brain hypothesis as traditionally formulated. It doesn't explain why brain expansion accelerated when it did. Primates have been social for 60 million years. If social complexity alone drove brain expansion, we would expect a steady increase in brain size throughout primate evolution. That's not what we see. What we see instead is relative stasis for millions of years, followed by dramatic acceleration beginning around 2 million years ago. Something changed. Something shifted the selective environment. Something made larger brains suddenly much more valuable than they had been before. That something, increasingly, appears to be fire. Not just because fire provided the calories for larger brains, but because fire transformed the social environment in ways that made larger brains pay off. Think about what fire does to a social group. Fire extends the day. Before fire, hominins, like all diurnal primates, were forced into inactivity at nightfall. Darkness meant danger. Darkness meant predators. Darkness meant huddling in trees or caves, trying to survive until dawn. Fire pushes back the darkness. It creates a sphere of light in which social activity can continue. Not foraging, that still requires daylight, but socializing, bonding, interacting. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner has studied firelight among the Jahansi of the Kalahari, one of the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies. Her findings are striking. Daytime conversation among the Jahansi focuses on practical matters: food distribution, resource conflicts, work coordination. The talk is functional, often tense, centered on immediate concerns. Nighttime conversation is different. At night, around the fire, the Jahansi tell stories. They sing. They discuss relationships, kinship, distant places, the doings of people not present. Fully 81% of firelight conversation consists of storytelling and discussion of social relationships, compared to only 34% of daytime talk. Fire creates a different social space, a space for narrative, for imagination, for the transmission of culture. Now imagine this dynamic playing out over evolutionary time. A hominin group that controls fire gains extra hours of safe social interaction. Those hours are spent differently than daytime hours, less focused on practical matters, more focused on social relationships and storytelling. In this context, a larger brain pays off. A larger brain can track more relationships, can remember more stories, can understand more complex social dynamics, can learn from the experiences of others through narrative rather than direct observation. A larger brain can navigate the extended social world that firelight creates. And so the hominins with larger brains would have been more successful in fire-using groups. They would have survived better, reproduced more, passed on whatever genetic factors contributed to their enhanced cognition. Generation by generation, millennium by millennium, the fire selected for the brain. The brain, in turn, enabled more sophisticated use of fire. A feedback loop, an accelerating spiral, a partnership between flame and neuron that would produce, eventually, everything we call human civilization. But we are still speaking in generalities. Let us be more specific. Let us trace the actual neural changes that fire helped produce. The prefrontal cortex. This region, the most distinctively human part of the human brain, is responsible for what psychologists call executive function, planning, decision-making, impulse control, the ability to hold information in working memory and manipulate it, the capacity to imagine futures that don't yet exist. Every one of these functions would have been advantageous in a fire-using species. Fire requires planning. You must gather fuel before you need it, not after. You must anticipate when your fire will die and prepare accordingly. You must think ahead. Fire requires impulse control. The natural response to fire is fear and flight. To use fire, you must suppress that response. You must override instinct with intention. This is precisely what the prefrontal cortex does. Fire requires working memory. Maintaining a fire involves tracking multiple variables simultaneously: fuel supplies, weather conditions, the fire's current state, the needs of the group. You must hold all of this in mind and coordinate your actions accordingly. The hominin who could do these things better would be more successful at fire maintenance. More successful at fire maintenance meant better survival. Better survival meant more reproduction. More reproduction meant more spread of the genes underlying enhanced prefrontal function. Fire didn't just benefit from the prefrontal cortex. Fire created the selective pressure that built the prefrontal cortex. The temporal lobes. These regions, tucked behind your temples, are crucial for memory and language. They contain the hippocampus, which transforms experience into lasting memory. They contain Wernicke's area and other regions essential for speech comprehension.
How would fire select for enhanced temporal function? Consider memory first. A fire-following hominin, like the grandmother's descendants, needed to remember where fires had occurred, where they were likely to occur again, where fuel could be found, where water was available to support camps. The cognitive demands of fire-based subsistence required spatial memory far beyond what simpler foraging strategies demanded. And then consider language. We don't know when language evolved. This is one of the great unsolved problems in human evolution. The archaeological evidence is ambiguous. The fossil evidence provides hints, but not certainty. But we know that language requires context. It requires situations where communication is valuable. It requires motivation to develop and refine an incredibly complex cognitive system. Fire provides that context. Nighttime gatherings around the flame create precisely the conditions under which language would be advantageous. A space for storytelling, a need to transmit complex information, an audience with time to listen. The temporal lobes, like the prefrontal cortex, may owe their distinctively human elaboration to the selection pressures that fire created. The parietal lobes. These regions, at the top and rear of the brain, are responsible for spatial reasoning, mathematical cognition, and the integration of sensory information. They are crucial for tool use, for understanding how objects relate in three-dimensional space, for planning the sequences of movements needed to shape stone or build structures. Fire-using hominins were, almost by definition, tool-using hominins. The behaviors are linked. Both require the same underlying cognitive capacities: spatial reasoning, causal understanding, planning, fine motor control. But fire adds something else. Fire provides light for tool making. Before fire, tool making was limited to daylight hours. After fire, the work could continue into the night. More practice, more refinement, more selection pressure for the cognitive capacities that enabled skilled manufacture. We see this in the archaeological record. The stone tools of fire-using Homo erectus, the Acheulean hand axes, are dramatically more sophisticated than the tools of earlier hominins. They show symmetry, standardization, aesthetic consideration beyond mere function. These tools were made by brains that fire had shaped. Brains with enhanced parietal function. Brains that could imagine forms before creating them. The mirror neuron system. This network of neurons, distributed across multiple brain regions, fires both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that action. It is thought to be crucial for imitation, empathy, and social learning. Humans have an extraordinarily developed mirror neuron system. It enables us to learn by watching, to understand others' intentions by simulating them internally, to build culture through the transmission of skills from individual to individual. Fire, once again, provides the selective context. Around the fire, hominins watched each other. They observed tool-making, food preparation, social interactions. The firelight made observation possible after dark. The safety of the fire circle created opportunities for sustained attention. Those who could learn from observation could literally mirror the actions they witnessed, would have gained skills faster, built social bonds more effectively, navigated the complex dynamics of the firelit group more successfully. The mirror neuron system, like so much else in the human brain, bears the imprint of fire's selective pressure. We could continue. Every region of the human brain that differs significantly from our closest relatives shows evidence of having been shaped by the selective pressures that fire created. The cerebellum, expanded for the complex motor sequences of tool-making and fire-tending. The insular cortex, enhanced for the social emotions that bind firelit communities together. The anterior cingulate, refined for the conflict monitoring and error detection that fire maintenance requires. Fire didn't create these structures from nothing. They existed in our ancestors, in reduced form, before fire entered hominin life. But fire provided the selective environment in which their expansion paid off. Fire created the conditions under which larger, more sophisticated brains were worth their enormous metabolic cost. This is the brain that fire built. Your brain. The organ that should not exist, but does. Because 3 million years ago, a grandmother held a burning branch, and the universe changed. There is one more aspect of brain evolution that we must address, one that is perhaps the most remarkable of all. The human brain is not just large, it is plastic. Plasticity refers to the brain's ability to change in response to experience, to rewire itself, to grow new connections and prune old ones based on what its owner learns and does. All mammalian brains show some plasticity, but the human brain is extraordinary in this regard. Our neurons form and reform connections throughout life. Our neural architecture is shaped not just by genes, but by experience, culture, learning. This is why humans can adapt to such a wide range of environments and lifestyles. Why we can learn languages, or musical instruments, or complex technologies at any age. Why culture can shape our brains as much as genes do. And plasticity, like so much else, connects to fire. A fire-using species faces an ever-changing environment. Not the slow environmental changes that drive genetic evolution, but rapid cultural changes. New techniques for fire maintenance, new uses for fire,
new social arrangements around the fire. A rigid brain, one determined entirely by genetics, would be at a disadvantage in such an environment. It couldn't adapt fast enough. It would be stuck with ancestral responses to novel situations. But a plastic brain can change within a single lifetime, can learn new techniques, can adapt to new social arrangements, can track cultural innovation as it happens. Fire created an environment where plasticity paid off, and so our brains became plastic, malleable, shaped by culture as much as by nature. This is perhaps fire's greatest gift, not just the brain itself, but a brain capable of infinite learning, infinite adaptation, infinite growth. The brain that fire built is still being built. Every time you learn something new, every time you form a new memory or master a new skill, you are continuing the process that began in that Ethiopian ash field 3 million years ago. The grandmother's legacy lives on, in every thought you think, in every connection you make, in every fire you kindle in the darkness of your mind. The stars turn overhead. The fire burns low. Around the flames, faces flickering in the ancient light, human beings sit in the configuration that their ancestors have assumed for millions of nights. They are telling stories. They are sharing knowledge. They are building, thought by thought, the civilization that will one day reach the stars. The brain that fire built is dreaming of fires yet to come. The family that fire forged. Let us speak of something that seems obvious but is not. Human beings pair bond. We form long-term relationships between males and females that persist beyond the immediate act of reproduction. We raise children together, often for decades. We build families, not just mother and offspring units, which are common across mammals, but father-mother offspring units that form the foundation of virtually every human society ever documented. This is strange. Among our closest relatives, it barely exists. Chimpanzee males do not pair bond. They mate promiscuously, compete intensely for access to females, and take no interest in offspring beyond occasional tolerance. Gorilla males form harems rather than pairs, and their investment in offspring is defensive rather than nurturing. Orangutans are largely solitary. Bonobos are complicated, but certainly not pair-bonded in the human sense. Where did human pair bonding come from? Why do we form families when our nearest relatives do not? The answer, once again, leads back to fire. To understand this, we need to think about food differently. In most primate societies, food is found and eaten on the spot. A chimpanzee discovers a fruit tree, eats until satisfied, moves on. There is sharing. Mothers share with infants. Sometimes males share meat with females in exchange for mating opportunities. But the baseline is individual foraging and individual consumption. This system has a brutal logic. The individual who finds food eats food. The individual who fails to find food goes hungry. There is no accumulation, no storage, no delayed consumption. Fire changes this. Fire creates a location, the hearth, where food is processed. You cannot cook while moving. You cannot roast a tuber on the run. To use fire for food preparation, you must stop. You must stay in one place for at least the duration of the cooking. This creates something new in hominin social life, a central place, a home base, a location where group members reliably return, where food is brought rather than consumed at the point of acquisition, where resources can be accumulated and shared. This seemingly simple change has revolutionary implications. Consider the problem from the perspective of a fire-using female. She is nursing an infant. This infant requires enormous maternal investment, years of carrying, nursing, protecting. She cannot forage efficiently while burdened with a dependent child. Her productivity is reduced. Her vulnerability is increased. In a non-fire society, this female's options are limited. She can rely on her own foraging, supplemented perhaps by occasional sharing from relatives. She is dependent on what she herself can gather, which is not much while nursing. Her survival and her infant's survival hangs by a thread. But in a fire society, there is a central place, a hearth, a location where food is brought and processed. A female tied to this location by her infant can still access food, food brought by others, food that accumulates at the home base, food that can be shared. And who would bring food? The anthropologist Owen Lovejoy proposed an answer decades ago, though he didn't fully connect it to fire. Males. Specifically, males who had some expectation of reproductive access to the females they were provisioning. This is the evolutionary logic of pair bonding. A male who provisions a female gains reproductive advantages. The female survives better. Her infants survive better. The male's genes, transmitted through those infants, spread through the population. A female who accepts provisioning from a male gains survival advantages. She and her offspring are more likely to survive. She becomes more selective about which males she mates with, preferring provisioners over non-provisioners. This creates a feedback loop. Males who provision are preferred. Females who accept provisioning produce more surviving offspring. The genes underlying both behaviors spread. Pair bonding becomes the norm. Fire made this possible. Fire created the central place where provisioning could occur. Fire transformed hominin social structure from the chimpanzee pattern to something new, something human. But pair bonding alone does not make a family in the human sense. Human families are not just male-female offspring units. They are embedded in larger networks. Grandparents contribute to child care. Aunts and uncles provide support. Siblings help raise younger siblings. The human family is not nuclear but extended, not isolated but connected. Where does this come from? Once again, the hearth provides the answer. A fire does not benefit only those who tend it. Fire creates a public good, warmth, light, protection, that extends to everyone in its vicinity. You cannot exclude others from the fire's benefit without extinguishing the fire itself. This means that fire-using groups must be cooperative groups. There is no evolutionary stable strategy based on fire hoarding. The physics of fire itself forces sharing. And around the shared fire, extended families form. Grandmothers help tend the flames while mothers forage. They watch the infants, prepare the food, maintain the home base. This is the grandmother hypothesis, proposed by the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes. The idea that human postmenopausal longevity evolved because grandmothers provided crucial support to their daughters' reproduction. Grandfathers contribute too in many societies. They craft tools, share knowledge, provide wisdom accumulated over decades of experience. Older siblings help with younger siblings. Adolescents learn adult skills by contributing to camp maintenance. Children play at the edge of the firelight,
learning through observation the skills they will need as adults. The fire does not create these relationships. Kinship exists independently of fire. But fire provides the spatial and temporal context in which extended family cooperation becomes practical. Fire creates the home base where multiple generations can contribute to collective survival. Fire forged the human family. And with the family came something else: division of labor. In most animal species, individuals are generalists. Each individual must be able to perform all the tasks necessary for survival. A chimpanzee cannot afford to specialize in fruit finding at the expense of predator detection. Both skills are necessary, and no other individual can be relied upon to compensate for weakness in either. Humans are different. Human societies are characterized by extensive specialization. In even the simplest hunter-gatherer societies, there is division of labor by sex, by age, by individual skill. Some individuals focus on hunting, others focus on gathering, others focus on childcare, tool manufacture, fire maintenance, healing, ritual. How is this possible? It's possible because resources are pooled. At the hearth, different contributions combine. The meat brought by hunters feeds everyone, including those who cannot hunt. The tubers gathered by foragers feed everyone, including those who cannot forage. The fire maintained by elders warms everyone, including those who gathered the fuel. No individual needs to do everything because the group, collectively, does everything. This is an enormously powerful adaptation. Specialization allows expertise. Expertise improves productivity. Improved productivity generates surplus. Surplus enables population growth, technological development, cultural elaboration. But specialization requires trust. You cannot afford to specialize if you cannot rely on others to provide what you do not produce. You cannot become an expert hunter if you fear that others will not share plant foods with you. You cannot become an expert gatherer if you fear that others will not share meat. Trust, in turn, requires repeated interaction. Predictable behavior. The ability to track who cooperates and who defects, who shares and who hoards, who contributes and who free rides. The fire circle provides this. Night after night, the same individuals gather around the same flames. Reputations form. Relationships deepen. Trust builds or erodes based on observed behavior. The hearth is not just a cooking location. The hearth is the original social contract. This brings us to something more speculative, but potentially more important than anything we have discussed. Language. No one knows when language evolved. The fossil record is silent on this question. Language leaves no direct trace in bones or stones. Estimates range from 50,000 years ago to 2 million years ago, with evidence that can be marshaled on all sides. But wherever language originated, fire was there. Think about what language requires. It requires sustained attention between communicators. You cannot develop complex symbolic communication if your interactions are fleeting, interrupted, focused on immediate practical concerns. It requires shared reference. You cannot build a vocabulary if you cannot jointly attend to objects and events, if you cannot establish common ground about what your signals mean. It requires cultural transmission. Language is not innate. It must be learned. And learning requires extended interaction between competent speakers and learners. Fire provides all of this. The firelit evening creates sustained interaction. Hours of social time with no foraging pressure, no movement imperative, no immediate practical demands. Time to communicate, time to listen, time to practice. Fire creates shared reference. Around the fire, all eyes can attend to the same objects, the same events, the same individuals. The firelight creates a common perceptual ground. We all see what the light reveals. Fire creates the context for cultural transmission. Children at the edge of the firelight watch and listen as adults interact. They absorb language not through formal instruction, but through immersion in a language-rich environment. We cannot prove that fire was necessary for language evolution, but we can say that fire created precisely the conditions under which language would be advantageous, would be learnable, would spread. The firelight conversation is the original language classroom, and we are still its students. Polly Wiesner's research among the Zhuangzi, which we mentioned earlier, provides a window into what firelight conversation might have looked like over evolutionary time. During the day, Zhuangzi talk about practical matters. Where are the mongongo nuts ripening? Who will help me carry this meat? That lazy so-and-so didn't contribute to the hunt. The conversation is functional, often contentious, focused on the business of survival. At night, everything changes. Stories emerge. Tales of hunts and journeys, of ancestors and spirits, of distant places and long-ago events. The repertoire expands beyond the immediate, the practical, the here and now. 81% of nighttime conversation is storytelling. This is not entertainment in the trivial sense. This is the transmission of culture. The stories encode knowledge: where to find water in drought, how to track specific animals, what plants are medicinal and which are poisonous. They encode social norms: who behaved admirably, who behaved shamefully, what happens to those who violate the group's expectations. They encode identity: who we are, where we came from, what makes us different from other groups. Language in the firelight is not just communication, it is culture itself. And with culture comes something that seems uniquely human: ritual. Every human society practices ritual, formalized, symbolic behaviors that mark transitions, celebrate events, invoke forces beyond the immediate and material. Birth rituals, death rituals, coming-of-age rituals, marriage rituals, rituals of healing, of purification, of sacrifice, of prayer. Where does ritual come from? The anthropologist Terence Deacon has argued that ritual emerges from the same cognitive capacities that enable language: the ability to think symbolically, to let one thing stand for another, to manipulate abstract representations of reality. But ritual is not just symbolic. It is also embodied, physical, performed, and it is almost always performed around fire. Think of every ritual you have ever witnessed or participated in: birthday candles, funeral pyres, vigil lights, the Olympic flame, candlelight services, bonfires on solstice nights. Fire is not incidental to human ritual. Fire is central. Why? Because fire itself is transformative. Fire changes things. Fire converts wood to ash, raw to cooked, darkness to light. Fire is the original technology of transformation, and transformation is what ritual is about. A coming-of-age ritual transforms a child into an adult. A marriage ritual transforms individuals into a pair. A funeral ritual transforms a person into an ancestor. These are not physical transformations.
They happen in the social world, in the realm of meaning and status and identity. But we mark them with fire because fire is the template for transformation. Fire taught us that things can change. Fire showed us that transformation is possible. And we have been ritualizing that lesson ever since. Let us return one final time to our grandmother. We have followed her through terror and discovery, through revelation and learning. We have watched her hold fire, use fire, feed fire. We have traced the consequences of her actions across 3 million years of evolution. But we have not asked the most important question. What did it feel like? What was the subjective experience of that first hominin who held a burning branch and didn't run? We cannot know. The grandmother left no testimony, no record, no account of her inner life. We can only imagine. But imagination is not nothing. Imagination is, in fact, the most human thing of all. Picture her in the moments after the sabertooth fled. She stands in the ash, the burning branch still clutched in her trembling hand. Her heart is pounding. Her breath comes in ragged gasps. The adrenaline of the encounter is still flooding her system, preparing her for a flight that is no longer necessary. The predator is gone. She has survived. And she is holding the thing that made survival possible. She looks at the fire. It is dying now, the brief flare of the attack already fading to a dull glow. But it is still there, still warm, still alive in some way that she cannot articulate but can sense. What does she feel? Fear, certainly. The fire is dangerous. Every instinct tells her so. The heat that radiates from the ember speaks of pain, of injury, of death. She should drop it, should flee from it, should return to the safety of the familiar. But she doesn't. Something else is present. Something that has no name in her experience. Something that we might call wonder. She is looking at something new. She is looking at something that has saved her. She is looking at something that might, if she can understand it, change everything. This is the moment when humanity begins. Not in a genetic mutation, not in an anatomical change, but in a psychological shift. A willingness to hold the dangerous thing. A decision to wonder instead of flee. The grandmother could not know what would come of her wonder. She could not see the chain of consequences stretching forward through time. She could not imagine the cities and the symphonies, the rockets and the religions, the wars and the weddings that would follow from this moment. She knew only what was in front of her, fire, held in her hand, waiting to be understood. 3 million years later, we are still that grandmother, still holding fire, still wondering what it means, still standing at the edge of the known, looking into the transformative light, deciding whether to flee or to stay. The fire still burns. The question still hangs in the air. What will we do with this gift? What will we make of this power? What will we become? The grandmother couldn't answer these questions. Neither can we. But we can keep the fire burning. We can pass it on to those who come after. We can trust that they too will stand at the edge of the light, wondering. This is the inheritance that fire gave us. Not just warmth, not just safety, not just cooked food and larger brains, but wonder. The capacity to look at something terrifying and see possibility. The courage to hold the flame. The fire still burns. It has never gone out. The fire that never went out. Stand with me at the edge of time. Look back. 3 million years of darkness and light, of fear and wonder, of flame passed from hand to hand across generations beyond counting. The grandmother is there, at the beginning, her trembling fingers closing around that first burning branch. And stretching forward from her, link by link, an unbroken chain of firekeepers who carried the flame through ice ages and droughts, through migrations and extinctions, through every catastrophe that should have ended the human experiment, but did not. The fire never went out. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. For most of human history, this was literal truth. Before we learned to make fire, and that knowledge came late, perhaps only a few 100,000 years ago, we could only keep it. The flame that burned in our ancestors' camps was descended from flames that burned in their ancestors' camps, stretching back through time in an unbroken lineage of combustion. Fire, like life itself, could only come from fire, and like life, fire had to be protected, nurtured, fed, carried through every hardship. A group that let their fire die faced a crisis of existence. They would have to find natural fire, from lightning strikes, from volcanic activity, from the rare gift of wildfire, or merge with another group that still possessed flame. Fire was not a tool in those ancient days. Fire was a member of the tribe. Fire was an ancestor. This changes how we must understand human history. We speak of technological revolutions as though they were events, singular moments when everything changed. The agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, the digital revolution. Neat categories, clean boundaries, before and after. But fire was not like this. Fire was not an event, but a relationship. A relationship that began 3 million years ago and continues to this moment. A relationship that has shaped every human technology, every human institution, every human thought. Consider what fire gave us. Fire gave us cooked food, and cooked food gave us the metabolic budget for larger brains. Every thought you have ever had exists because fire freed the calories. Fire gave us extended days, and extended days gave us time for socialization, for learning, for the accumulation of culture. Every story you have ever heard exists because fire created the space for storytelling. Fire gave us protection, and protection gave us the security to gather in larger groups, to specialize in different tasks, to build complex societies. Every institution you participate in exists because fire made cooperation possible. Fire gave us transformation, the visible, tangible proof that matter can change form, that the world can be reshaped by intention and action. Every technology you use exists because fire taught us that transformation is possible. Fire is not one technology among many. Fire is the mother of all technologies. Let us trace the lineage. From fire comes heat. From controlled heat comes ceramics, the first synthetic material. Clay transformed into pottery. Stone into brick. Sand into glass. Ceramics enable storage. Storage enables surplus. Surplus enables civilization. From fire comes metallurgy, the discovery that certain rocks, when heated sufficiently, yield metal. Copper first, then bronze, then iron, then steel. Metals enable tools that no stone can match. Metals enable weapons that reshape the balance of power. Metals enable machines that multiply human strength beyond all natural limits. From fire comes chemistry, the understanding that heat drives reactions, that substances can be combined and transformed, that matter is not fixed but fluid. Chemistry enables medicine, agriculture, manufacturing. Chemistry enables us to reshape the molecular world to human purposes. From fire comes engines, the realization that fire's expansion can be harnessed, that combustion can drive pistons and turbines, that the energy locked in fuel can be converted to motion. Engines enable transportation beyond animal power. Engines enable industry beyond human muscle. Engines enable the modern world. From fire, from the same oxidation reaction that burned in the grandmother's trembling hand, comes everything. The car you drive burns fire. The plane you fly burns fire. The electricity that powers the device on which you are watching this video comes, in most of the world, from burning fire. Coal, gas, oil, the transformed remains of ancient life, releasing stored solar energy through combustion. Even nuclear power, even solar panels, even the most advanced energy technologies we possess exist because fire-using humans developed the science and engineering to create them. The chain is unbroken. The lineage is clear. Fire all the way down. But the influence of fire extends beyond technology. Consider art. The oldest known artworks are found in caves, Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, dozens of others scattered across Europe and beyond. Painted images of animals and hands and abstract symbols created tens of thousands of years ago by people whose lives were utterly different from ours. These artworks were created by firelight, not by daylight streaming through cave entrances. These paintings are found deep underground, in chambers that natural light never reaches. Their creators worked by the flickering illumination of burning torches, fat-burning lamps, carefully tended flames carried into the earth's darkness. Fire enabled art, and the art, in turn, reflects fire's influence. The paintings dance in torchlight. The animals seem to move as the flames flicker. The artists understood this. They used it. They created works designed to be seen by firelight, works that come alive in the dancing illumination that artificial light can never replicate. Fire is not just a technology. Fire is an aesthetic, a way of seeing, a mode of experience. Consider religion. We have already spoken of ritual, of the centrality of fire to human ceremonial life. But the connection goes deeper. Fire is present in virtually every religious tradition on earth. In Zoroastrianism, fire is the supreme symbol of divine truth. Temples maintain eternal flames that have burned, in some cases, for over 1,000 years. The religion's name for God, Ahura Mazda, means Lord of Wisdom, and wisdom is associated with light, with illumination, with the fire that dispels darkness. In Hinduism, Agni, the god of fire, is one of the most important deities of the Vedic pantheon. Every sacrifice, every ritual, every wedding ceremony requires fire. The funeral pyre releases the soul from the body. Fire is the messenger between humans and gods. In Judaism and Christianity, fire marks the presence of the divine. The burning bush that spoke to Moses. The pillar of fire that led the Israelites through the wilderness. the tongues of flame at Pentecost, the eternal light that burns in synagogues and churches around the world. In Buddhism, fire is a central metaphor. The Buddha spoke of the fire sermon, the teaching that all existence is burning with the flames of desire, hatred, and ignorance. Enlightenment is the extinguishing of these flames. The word nirvana literally means blowing out. Across cultures, across continents, across millennia, fire appears as a symbol of the sacred, of transformation, of the power that transcends ordinary existence. This is not coincidence. This is the grandmother's legacy. Fire was the first power that humans controlled, the first force that set us apart from other animals, the first evidence that we could shape the world rather than merely endure it. Of course, we made it sacred. Of course, we built our religions around it. What else could we have done? Consider philosophy. The ancient Greeks, who laid the foundations of Western thought, were obsessed with fire. Heraclitus of Ephesus, writing around 500 BCE, proposed that fire was the fundamental substance of the universe. "This world," he wrote, "which is the same for all, no one of gods or men has made, but it always was, is, and will be, an ever-living fire, with measures of it kindling and measures going out." For Heraclitus, fire was not just an element, it was a principle, the principle of change, of flux, of eternal transformation. Everything flows, he taught. Nothing remains the same. And fire, always consuming, always changing, always moving, was the perfect symbol of this cosmic truth. Plato, a century later, incorporated fire into his cosmology. In the Timaeus, he described how the divine craftsman created the universe from the four elements, with fire providing heat and light. He used fire as a metaphor for the highest form of knowledge, the good that illuminates all other truths, like the sun illuminating the visible world. Aristotle systematized these ideas into a theory of elements that would dominate Western science for 2,000 years. Fire, he taught, was one of the four fundamental substances from which all matter was composed. It had a natural tendency to move upward toward the heavens. It was associated with the qualities of hot and dry, the vital heat that distinguished the living from the dead. These philosophies were wrong, scientifically speaking. Fire is not an element. Fire is a process, a chemical reaction, the rapid oxidation of fuel in the presence of heat. The Greeks did not understand this, but they were right about something deeper. They were right that fire represents a fundamental principle, the principle of transformation, the principle of energy. The principle that matter is not inert but dynamic, not fixed but flowing, not permanent but always, always changing. Fire taught us this. Fire has been teaching us this for 3 million years. Consider science. The scientific revolution, that explosion of systematic inquiry that began in Europe around the 16th century, and has reshaped human existence ever since, was, in profound ways, a revolution of fire. The alchemists who preceded modern chemistry were seekers after fire's secrets. They heated substances in crucibles and alembics, watching transformations, recording results, building the empirical foundation on which chemistry would eventually stand. Their quest for the philosopher's stone, the substance that could transmute base metals into gold, was a quest for the mastery of transformation that fire had first revealed. The physicists who created thermodynamics, the science of heat and energy, were studying fire in its most abstract form. They discovered that heat is not a substance, but a form of energy. That energy can be converted from one form to another, but never created or destroyed. That there is a fundamental limit to the efficiency of any heat engine. These discoveries, made in the 18th and 19th centuries, unlocked the power of the Industrial Revolution and laid the groundwork for modern physics. The chemists who finally understood combustion, Lavoisier, Priestley, and their contemporaries, overturned millennia of misconception. Fire is not the release of a mysterious substance called phlogiston. Fire is the combination of fuel with oxygen. Fire is oxidation. Fire is chemistry. And the nuclear physicists of the 20th century discovered the ultimate fire. The fire that burns in the sun. The fire that powers the stars. The fire that we unleashed, terribly, over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and have been struggling to control ever since. Nuclear fusion. Nuclear fission. The fires of creation and destruction. 3 million years of fascination with flame led to this. The grandmother, reaching for that first burning branch, set in motion a chain of inquiry that would not end until we had unlocked the fires of the cosmos itself. And now we stand at another threshold. The fire that has carried us from the Pliocene to the present is threatening to consume us. You know this already. Climate change, global warming. The consequences of 2 centuries of burning fossil fuels, the ancient stored sunlight of millions of years, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate the Earth has not experienced in millions of years. This is fire's shadow side. Fire creates, fire transforms, fire enables. But fire also destroys. The same power that cooked our food and forged our tools and lit our way through the darkness is now threatening the stability of the climate on which human civilization depends. The fires we have set, in power plants and engines, in factories and furnaces, are warming the planet, raising the seas, disrupting the patterns of weather and ecology that we have depended on since the dawn of agriculture. This is not fire's fault. Fire is a process, a reaction, a tool. It has no intentions, no desires, no morality. Fire simply does what fire does. The responsibility is ours. We are the fire keepers. We have been the fire keepers for 3 million years, and now we face the greatest test of our stewardship. Can we control the fire we have unleashed? Can we transform our relationship with fire once again? Can we find new fires, cleaner fires, sustainable fires to carry us into the future? The answer is not yet written, but the capacity to write it exists. It exists in the brains that fire built, in the cultures that fire created, in the institutions and technologies and accumulated wisdom of 3 million years of firekeeping. The grandmother faced her own moment of crisis, a predator charging. No trees to climb, no escape route, just a dying ember and a choice. She could have dropped the branch. She could have fled. She could have accepted what seemed inevitable. Instead, she swung the fire. We are her descendants, her heirs, the inheritors of her courage and her creativity and her willingness to face the terrifying unknown. The fire still burns. The choice
is still ours. Let me tell you one last story. In 1972, the astronauts of Apollo 17, the last humans to walk on the moon, looked back at Earth. They saw a blue marble floating in the blackness, swirled with white clouds, impossibly beautiful, impossibly fragile. They took a photograph. It became one of the most reproduced images in human history. The blue marble, our home. But there was something the photograph could not show. At night, if you look at Earth from space, you see something else. You see lights, cities blazing with electricity, highways traced in headlight streams, oil fields flaring gas, ships burning across the oceans. A web of illumination covering the planet, concentrated in some regions, sparse in others, but present almost everywhere. This is fire. Not open flame mostly, but fire nonetheless. Electricity generated by burning fossil fuels. Lights powered by the transformation of matter into energy. The descendant of every fire that has ever burned in human hands, multiplied and distributed across the globe. From space, the Earth looks like it's on fire, because it is. It has been on fire for 3 million years. The grandmother lit the first spark, and every fire since then, every campfire and cooking fire and forge fire, every candle and lamp and light bulb, every engine and reactor and power plant, has been part of the same great burning. One fire, unbroken, spreading across the world, reaching for the stars. There is a probe somewhere out beyond the orbit of Neptune, still sending signals back to Earth. Voyager 1, launched in 1977, the most distant human-made object in existence. It carries a golden record, a message to anyone who might find it in some unimaginably distant future. The record contains images and sounds and greetings in 55 languages. It contains music, Bach and Beethoven, Chuck Berry and Blind Willie Johnson. It contains the brain waves of a woman in love. It is a message in a bottle, thrown into the cosmic ocean. And it exists because of fire. Every piece of technology that built it, launched it, tracked it, communicated with it, all of it descends from fire. The metal alloys, the electronic circuits, the rocket fuel that lifted it from Earth, the nuclear battery that powers it still. Fire sent that probe into the darkness. Fire is reaching for the stars. And somewhere, perhaps, in some future we cannot imagine, beings we cannot conceive will find that probe. They will decode its message. They will learn that once, on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star, creatures who called themselves human sent a piece of themselves into the void. Those beings will not know about the grandmother. They will not know about the burning branch, the sabertooth, the moment when everything changed. But they will know this, that the creatures who made this object were creatures of fire, creatures who learned to transform, creatures who refused to accept the darkness, creatures who carried a flame across 3 million years and then hurled it toward the stars. The fire still burns. It burns in the power plants, in the engines, in the furnaces and the reactors. It burns in the laboratories, where scientists probe the secrets of matter and energy. It burns in the minds that wonder and question and refuse to stop asking why. It burns in you. Every calorie that powers your thoughts is fire transformed. Every neuron that fires in your brain is chemistry descended from combustion. Every dream you dream, every idea you have, every moment of wonder and terror and hope, all of it is fire's gift. The grandmother gave us more than survival. She gave us the universe. She gave us ourselves. 3 million years ago, in a burned landscape in Ethiopia, a grandmother held a burning branch. She was afraid. She was hungry. She was facing a world that wanted to kill her and everyone she loved. But she didn't drop the fire. She held on. And we, her children, her heirs, her continuation across the ages, we are still holding on. The fire still burns. It will never go out. Because we are the fire. We have always been the fire. And the fire goes on. The end.